Hello everyone, welcome to What If Hollow Knight Faced a War for Hallownest's Throne Part 3. Before we start, please go support Chronica's de Unfan for writing that awesome fanfic. This is the translated version I made, there will be some mistaken characters gender. Chap. 25, Peace in Kaminosu. The sun was barely rising over the horizon, and the slight increase in temperatures was already beginning to wake up the most lively people of Deep Nest. The city was slowly waking up, the streetlights were being renewed, and businesses were beginning to open their doors. Yesterday all the food stalls received their gifts, and you could already begin to smell the alternative meals prepared with tofu. The halls of the palace were also filled with life, as servants and guards moved from one place to another. Some for the change of shift, others starting to prepare everything for the start of the day at the palace. Especially in the kitchen, since breakfast should be ready when the diners woke up. However, away from all the commotion of the common hallways, a weaver walked softly down the hallway where Sendero Verdi's guests were resting. It was almost impossible for Hachi to sleep last night. Ghost was in her room, and that made her too nervous to get more than 5 hours of sleep. However, there was something he needed to understand. Something that only an insect would be able to understand. No. The weaver's knuckles knocked gently on the door, still doubting whether it would be wise to wake up a guest. However, he needed to talk to her as soon as possible. Hachi was about to play again when he heard small noises from inside the room. Heavy footsteps approached little by little until the handle was turned from the inside. When the door opened, it revealed the enormous insect sleeping inside. Hachi-san. What are you doing here so early? This kid, sorry for bothering you, but I need to talk to you. The huge insect was surprised by the sudden request, mixed with the fact that she was still half asleep. In fact, she looked very funny with her sleepy face and the leaves that made up her hair in a mess. However, the fact that the Khan of Deep Nest came personally to your room to talk about something should not be just any banality. Clear. Sit down, dear. Make yourself at home. A loquacious comment that brought out a couple of laughs, but laughs that didn't last long on the weaver's face. Hey, everything's fine. Yes, it's just I need to talk to you about something. I know we don't know each other very well, but you're the closest person I know to Ghost Dono. Ghost? He asked with concern. Tell me everything. Ghost Dono came to my room in the middle of the night. I didn't know what he wanted and I was a little scared, but he showed interest in my music. He wanted to hear music. That's new. I didn't really give it much importance and I played a song for him. The first one was very similar to the one you heard at dinner, but then I wanted to try something more melancholic. And what happened? He asked when he saw that Hachi took a long pause and lost himself in a nascent sadness. I played that song. I did not believe anything bad would happen. But then he burst into tears and I couldn't do anything to help him. I was afraid. I didn't know what was happening to him. I was scared to see him clenching his body like that, scratching his mask. I thought something bad would happen. I was very scared. Hachi's voice grew heavier and heavier until the bitterness and pain of remembering that scene silenced her almost completely as she had to resist her sobs. However, great was his surprise when he looked up again, only to see Kid shocked by such words, while a tear that Hachi did not understand ran down her face. Ghost, my little ghosty, did he cry? Asked the tallest one, to which Hachi only responded with a nod without understanding the bull's reaction. No, I need to see him, I need to see Ghost now. Hachi did not understand Kid's sudden alteration as he watched her put on something to cover herself before going out. The oldest seemed to be out of her mind, something that worried the weaver, thinking that something bad was happening to the ghost. Kid took the lead at a pace that the weaver found difficult to follow. The servants watched with concern as these two passed by them in a hurry, but seeing that they did not say anything they simply continued with their work, hoping that nothing bad had happened. Kid arrived and placed her hands on the door, but had to wait for the weaver to open her room with her keys. Hachi didn't understand what was happening, and her companion's lack of explanations for his behavior scared her more and more. As soon as the door opened, Kid entered without even asking permission, driven by a force that did not let her think clearly. He soon saw Ghost, lying on the floor, curled up in a ball and with his head resting on the pillow that Hachi had given him. Fast asleep. Hachi could breathe a sigh of relief when she saw Ghost in good condition, but now her concern extended to the other female in the room. Kid approached him carefully, as if she were really checking to see if he was asleep. His knees weakened a little, and he knelt next to the sleeping Ghost, while his hands rose to his mouth to curb his desire to cry, although the tears did fall down his face. Kid, don't know are you? Shhhhhhh, he told her to remain silent as he whispered. Let him sleep, let's go somewhere else. Both girls left the room and headed to a room not far away where they could sit and have something to drink. Hachi intercepted one of the servants and asked for some tea and snacks to be brought to them. Once in the room, the weaver took a seat, but Kid seemed to be unable to keep calm, pacing from left to right without stopping. Hachi could only wait for an answer to come eventually, as his companion didn't seem to answer his questions. Your Excellency, your appetizers. Thank you so much. The servant entered the room and left the food on a table, but even he couldn't help but hide his concern when he saw Keat in that state. He looked at the Khan, but she only motioned for him to leave, which he immediately obeyed. He'd don't know, please could you have a seat? He'd stopped at the weaver's call, and only then did she realize how long she had been in that state of thought. Somewhat embarrassed, she complied with her hostess's request and took a good sip of her tea to calm her mind a little. And after a long sigh and while Hachi was waiting, he spoke, without taking his eyes off the green liquid that was gently shaking in his glass. It's been years since I've met Ghost. I remember that day Dad brought him home. Gloomy. Lonely. Tired eyes. Getting close to him was very difficult, even though we were just a couple of kids, but we were all we had. He pauses to calm down, drink some more tea, and have a snack. Years that I tried to encourage him. That I tried to get him out of that bubble of suffering that surrounded him. Years without seeing him happy. Without seeing him sad. Without seeing him angry. Without seeing him showing interest in anything. Just an empty shell. And that hurt me. Once again, a tear runs down her cheek. I wanted him to open up to me, he was like a brother to me, but it's been so difficult, neither I nor Dad could do anything, just train until his body collapsed. The older insect had to cut off her words to control her emotions. The tea helped ease the pain, but this was too much. With one of her hands she rubbed her face, trying to calm down and drying her tears. Then, he felt a pair of hands grab his. A pair of warm hands. He looked up and saw the weaver, just as sad, but doing a better job of staying strong. Keat managed to smile, and by controlling her breathing, she was able to control her sorrows. So, he continued. Years of trying in vain and you managed to make that bubble open a little. I had never seen him sleep peacefully. I had never seen him sleep more than 4 hours a day, without waking up in the middle of the night shrieking in despair as nightmares tore his mind. I have no way to thank you. The weaver opened her eyes a little more when she felt the sudden embrace of the eldest of the two. It was fast, very fast. Enough to not even give him time to react. However, it was a hug he did not reject. A moment of comfort for both. After a while, Ghost's eyes slowly opened, still heavy from everything that had happened. Getting up was somewhat complex for him, since his body was experiencing an unusual fatigue for him. Side effects of decompression after letting out some of your pain. Furthermore, the solid ground was not very kind to the muscles and exoskeleton. It took Ghost a few seconds to realize where he was, and he remembered everything that happened last night. Having cried like that in front of Hachi left an unpleasant feeling inside, but at the same time, a light touch of calm caressed her heart as she wondered what time it was. The Ghost picked up the pillow and sheet that the weaver had given him and carefully left the room. The hallway was empty, and I really didn't have the slightest idea what I should do. His stomach warned him that he should eat food as soon as possible. Maybe he should go to the throne room and ask the first arachnid that comes his way. That was better than going back to his room and waiting who knows how long for someone to come after him. With a gentle step, Ghost passed through the passages of Deep Nest's palace, now admiring the decorations that he had previously completely ignored. It felt strange. His chest hurt a little, but his mind seemed calmer. As if some of the voices that tormented his head had disappeared. Or maybe, they were just giving him some time off. Everything looked so different. Do you need something? Ghost turned around, and his internal alarms were activated when he saw the enormous figure that gave rise to such a guttural voice. A huge being, similar to an arachnid, but with a Machiavellian appearance. A being who, despite being a resident of Deep Nest, seemed to keep a safe distance from the young warrior. Ghost also felt the same murderous thirst coming from him. He was an enemy, that was something he was completely sure of, but he knew he couldn't face him. Although his hands inside his hood were resting on his hidden weapons. I recognize you, you were in the Hall of Warriors yesterday. Ghost commented suspiciously. Forgive my late introduction. My name is Nosk. Deep Nest General. Ghost, he answered flatly. My pleasure, General Ghost. And yes, I was at dinner last night, but unfortunately I had to leave early due to personal matters. The Ghost remained stoic. He had nothing more to say to him, and he lacked the ability to carry on hypocritical conversations to know the enemy better. Ghost was a cold-eyed tomb. A look that seemed to read the soul of the very terror of Deep Nest. Something that did not go unnoticed by the arachnid himself. Well, I guess I should retire, General Ghost. A pleasure to have met you. I hope your stay at Deep Nest is stimulating. Ghost felt a chill run through his body at those words, but his gaze did not leave the colossal creature as it turned around and disappeared through the dark corridors of the palace. The Ghost did not relax at any time, and only when he felt Nosk's footsteps disappear completely was he able to relax his hands from his hidden weapons and regain regular breathing. Something that did not allow him to see what would happen next. Ghost. The ghost could only turn around when its head was wrapped in a hug, being compressed by Keed's strong limbs in her chest. The young woman did not look like someone weak, but the fact that she could pick up Ghost so easily and shake him like a rag doll suggested that her strength was much greater than what she showed at first glance. "You're going to disarm him, Miss Keed." Hachi's joking voice saved Ghost from having a deformed horn. However, he was still Ghost, and he didn't do much to try to defend himself from the deadly affection until finally, Keed left him on the ground with his neck slightly sore. However, he did not take a second to kneel in front of the weaver. "Hachi Domo. I hope you accept my apology for everything that happened last night." The phrase that could make you blush became a melancholic expression when the weaver remembered what happened the night before. His heart tightened as he remembered the fragility of the ghost, but he did his best to put a smile on his face. "Ghost Dono. Yo." Hachi tried to find words to express himself, but they just wouldn't come out of his mouth. Should he remove the wound and dig deeper into his heart? Or should I move on? Maybe it wasn't the time, nor the place. In the end, his expression of doubt only turned into one of happiness. "I'm glad to see that you are better. And don't worry about what happened. But, we should fix ourselves. I promised them a tour of the city. I hope you are ready." The stepsisters nodded and retired to their rooms to get ready. As expected, Breda was already awake, dressed and waiting in front of Keed's door, surely waiting for the designated time to wake her up. So great was his surprise to see her walking with Ghost back to the guest bedrooms. "Keed-sama. Ghost-sama. Oh, good morning, Breda-san. I'm surprised to see you awake so early. Little things happened, he. Breda's face couldn't show more confusion as she looked at both insects curiously. Ghost only greeted with a nod of his head as he continued on his way to his bedroom. Strange Ghost looked a little more energetic. "Did I miss something?" the beetle asked when Ghost finally left the place. Come in. I'll tell you inside." They both entered Keed's room, and while Breda helped the older girl to be more presentable, Keed told the beetle what had happened. At least, repeating the words that Hachi herself had used. Breda's face went through an endless number of emotions as the different fragments of the story were linked one after the other, but surprise was an emotion visible in her expression very frequently. However, when the story ended and the eldest's mane of leaves was something much more presentable, Keed turned around only to see a bitter expression of sadness and defeat on Breda's face. "I am happy for him," commented the beetle with muffled words, like someone trying to endure sadness. Keed turned around and saw the short insect with pity in her eyes. She knew about Breda's feelings about her stepbrother's disaster and she couldn't help but feel bad for her. There wasn't much he could do to help her, but a hand on her head, caressing between her antennae, would become a small dead support in that pain that the truth planted in the beetle's chest. Breda loved Ghost. However, it was another girl who was able to break through the ghost's layer of sadness and managed to connect with her emotions that many had already taken for granted. Breda controlled her tears in a grimace of spite, but she was happy that Ghost could have experienced something other than reluctance and indifference. At least Keed was a comfort to the young girl. Finally, the departure time arrived and everyone gathered to begin the tour. As promised, Sun Quang retreated back to Green Path as soon as he woke up with an escort of Ma soldiers. Sun Si, on the other hand, decided to stay and see these lands, although he seemed to have his own motivations. The temperature had risen enough, which marked the perfect time to begin the tour. The Khan Hornet and Hachi would be the guides of the small group made up of Keed, Breda, Sun Si and Ghost. And once they left the beast's abode, they began their journey. There were several turning points on the part of the sisters. Hornet and Hachi had different definitions of the word interesting, and their recommendations for places to visit varied quite a bit. In fact, their conversations were so heated that sometimes they didn't seem like princesses at all. However, after a tense debate and thanks to the mediating intervention of Keed, they were more or less able to reach an agreement and they drew up a route based more on the efficiency of the trip and not on the personal tastes of each princess. After all, for foreigners, anything could turn out to be interesting, no matter how banal or mundane it was. The first thing they visited was the blacksmith shop, which was not far from the war room. Green Path worked iron, but its metallurgical craftsmanship was not at the same level as the craftsmen of Deep Nest, who already mastered the art of steel. Which is why they were able to make needles, much stronger and thinner than the stingers of the Moss Guard. The general watched in amazement as the blacksmith shaped a piece of steel, forcefully crushing the alloy repeatedly to form a beautiful Damascus steel, destined to become the weapon of a newly promoted captain of the local guard. A process that also caught the attention of Ghost, with only the men in the group being interested in this type of thing. They could be there all day, but the tour had to continue its course, and now the group was entering the commercial area of the city, located not far from where they were. Which, in turn, served as the main link of the city. What most characterized Kaminosu City was the enormous cylindrical space located right in the middle of the city, where hundreds of businesses of all kinds were established on the walls. It was the economic and commercial center of the city and therefore where the largest number of individuals were concentrated. The insects went from one place to the other without stopping. Very different than in Concordia City, the group of Khan and generals passed as just another group regardless of the size or quality of their clothing. Deep Nest was a warrior town and those formalities of high society were indifferent to every being in that city. And it was at this point where the girls found a true haven of happiness. It was not difficult to see Ghost and Sun C waiting in front of a craft store while they waited for the girls to delight in the softness of the fabrics and garments that only the weavers were able to make in all of Hallownest. Even Keed, with her carefree attitude, couldn't help but fall into temptation. And what can we say about Bretta, who was not able to hide her enthusiasm for the quality of such works of art? Ah girls, no matter the species, there are things that never change. Sun C commented with a wry smile, trying to establish some conversation while they waited. Why are they taking so long? Patience, Ghost don't know. That this is just beginning. Dialysis started a few hours ago. I don't mean that. What I meant was you know what. Better forget it. He said with amusement, which Ghost didn't understand at all. Aren't you hungry? And? Maybe we should tell him to go get something to eat. And? More than 20 minutes have passed since they entered. Why are they taking so long? Don't know. Sun C sighed heavily. It was really difficult to deal with Ghost and his mostly monosyllabic responses. However, his question was unfounded by the sudden smell that came from a street spot not far from that place. One that had a couple of bugs lined up. Hey Ghost. Let's see what we can get from that position. The Ghost turns his head and notices the smoke coming from the small food stand. His sense of smell didn't feel anything special, but if it caught Sun C's attention, maybe it's a good thing. The huge insects lined up and when their turn finally came, they were attended to by a seven-legged weaver who spoke with complete freedom and confidence. Although he probably had no idea who those two were. Welcome to the stand of offense, you two really eat well. Referring mockingly to his pronounced height. What can I serve you? I don't really know any of those dishes. And your Ghost? The Ghost didn't say anything, instead he just pointed his finger at a small white ball that caught his attention. An order from Buse. What else? I really don't know, what do you recommend? Do you want to try the Hohit shumai? They are the specialty of the house. Well. I'll take my chances. The weaver took the orders and gave them to the starters, served on a sheet that contained the food. It was fast street food after all, so no formalities or etiquette. There are going to be 4 silks. 4 silks? The bargain, huh? Do you mean the silk yang? Why else? They're not from around here, right? No. We just arrived yesterday. It shows, hahaha. Well. We still wanted to order a couple more things. Even someone as clueless as Ghost reacted to those words. He almost forgot to order something for the rest, except that Sun C was more attentive, although he seemed very concentrated thinking about what else to order. I wonder what Hornet will like. For a girl? The weaver asked, unable to relate the name Hornet to the Khan of Deep Nest. In his mind, having royalty taste his food stall was a utopia. Yeah. Carnivorous. I think so. In that case, a kushier would be your best option. I guess I'll follow your advice. What do you think girls want, Ghost? The Ghost thought for a moment but soon had an idea and with his finger, he pointed to various foods on the counter, which were prepared with surprising speed by the weaver. Very good. There are going to be 15 silks. They both searched through their belongings, but in the end Ghost turned out to be the fastest, placing 6 white pounds on it. According to the trade agreement, 2 pounds would be the equivalent of 5 silks. Of course, that was information that had not yet reached the Sendero Verde passages. And the saleswoman's face said it all. And what is this? She said confused while taking one of the silver discs in her claws. That's not enough. I don't even know what this is. Hey, either they pay me or else. Suddenly, the weaver steps aside and takes a wooden stick which she uses to threaten the 2 generals. Sun C looked a little worried, Ghost was unfazed for a change. Hey, calm down. It's money. They are white pounds. Pounds, what are you also came from Sendero Verde? Sun C just nods his head. I don't trust them. Some of those traders say the new trade deal will be 1 pound for 5 silks. Others say 1 times 7. Sun C only sighed with regret at what he heard. It was not surprising that merchants wanted to take advantage of misinformation to make more money. Damn of ours. At least I could breathe easy that from that day on the population would begin to be informed about the currency exchange. No miss. The exchange will be 2 white pounds for 5 silk yang. That treatment is more favorable to me. But I still don't trust his words. Do you know what? Let's do something. I'll change it from 3 to 5. Just this once, the weaver thought for a bit, but in the end she let out a malicious smile. 1 by 1. It's the fairest thing. Until they announce the official change, I cannot trust the words anyone tells me. Sun Ce just sighed in defeat. He was already tired of this, and the least he wanted to do was use his status to impose his will. Not in that place. Not with so many plates of food in his hands. Plus, that seven-legged weaver looked pretty stubborn. So in the end, the general simply decided to pay the difference. It wasn't that money was a problem for someone like him, but the feeling of having been scammed and being unable to do anything about it left a bitter feeling in his mouth. Look. There they are. Ghost, Sun Ce. This way. The two generals turned their heads to the origin of the girls' voices and soon spotted the rest, who seemed to be looking for them. They both started on their way, which led to a small bench where the four of them were sitting. I see they bought something. Yes, they are hungry if they think about eating all that. Keed said with a clear amused expression on her face. There is no living being that can eat so much. Sun Ce responded ironically. Don't tempt Ghost then. They both approached and gave the girls what they had ordered for themselves. Ghost offered Bretta and Islal salad, a common appetizer among herbivores. Instead, he offered Hachi some Cavasuelos kakog. Well, my favorites. Said the weaver, feeling her mouth water. I saw you eat them last night. I figured you liked them. Thence that was a pretty elaborate sentence for a casual ghost conversation. Obviously there were some changes that only the most attentive could happily appreciate. On the other hand, Sun Ce offered a butatai kurga to Keed, who saw the fried rice dish with stars in her eyes. However, Hornet's face when he offered him the kushur that the cook had recommended was a mixture of shame and amazement. What's happening? Don't you like them? Sun Ce asked a little worried, seeing that Hornet seemed not to accept the dish. Yes, if I like them, responded the Red Weaver with a marked blush on her face. Take them. They are for you. Hornet hesitated a lot, but in the end he accepted it with shame. What a strange girl. She behaves the same as a warlord with the highest self-esteem in the world, or as a shy girl. Neither Bretta nor Keed nor Ghost understood this reaction. Much less Sun Ce himself. Who was the most confused of all. Although what did catch his attention was seeing Hachi with his eyes open, looking away while shaking his head somewhat amused, as if he knew something that the rest didn't. Of course, no one from Sendero Verde knew that, in Deep Nest, kushur was a food to be shared between pairs. Chap. 26 outburst. Strange noises are heard, coming from the deepest areas of the city of Kaminosu. Its ascending cylindrical shape gives it an effect similar to a wind instrument, whose notes travel stridently through the entire metal conduit. The big difference is that the sounds coming from the bottom of the city are much more chaotic. Hornet, Hachi, Keed, Bretta, Sun Ce and Ghost were alarmed by the scandal, unable to know, like the rest of the bugs present, what exactly was happening. They were about to finish the sandwiches, but they had to put the last leftovers aside to run around and figure out what was going on. Everyone looked out over the ledge, looking down, but the only thing noticeable was thousands of bugs running from one side to the other, but nothing that could give them a clue when a thought terrified the minds of several of those present. Deep Nest was on the verge of a civil outbreak due to the food crisis, but that didn't make sense. The rations that arrived yesterday should have been distributed to the population, which should have, at least, calmed social discontent, even if just a little. So why? What was happening? Damn, we have to warn about this. Hornet, go and tell Mother immediately. What are you up to? I don't want you to do anything stupid. I won't do it. But we must discover what happened before there are worse consequences. Ghost don't know, Sun Ce don't know, Keed don't know, Bretta-san. Please return to the palace with my sister. Hachi don't know. She can't go alone. He's still recovering. Bretta tried to reason with her. I agree. The eldest of the sons intervened. I must go with my troops and make sure everything is okay. Alan. Ghost's voice, although not strident, did not go unnoticed. I will accompany her. The White Weaver and everyone present looked at the ghost while he looked towards Hachi with some determination in his eyes. Changing his mind was not an option. That was something that became very clear. I'm going with you, little brother. No Keed. Return to the palace and protect Bretta-san. But I can fight too if you give me a bow. I could. Not today, Bretta-san. Ghost's own voice was the one that stopped the beetle's determination. While it was true that Bretta had been practicing with a bow for a considerable time, she was far from being able to use it in a confrontation. Much less be able to kill someone in the process. However, Ghost didn't back down, even when Bretta deflated on his shoulder. However, everyone understood the ghost's decision. Come on, Bretta-san. On another occasion it will be. And? Feeling worthless leaves a bitter taste in your mouth and a feeling of helplessness in the middle of your chest. However, everything has its time and we all have our purpose. And on this occasion, Bretta's purpose was far from any conflict. At least for the moment. Without further hesitation, each one went their own way. General Sun Ce headed to the outskirts of the city, where his troops were resting, ignorant of what was happening inside the city. Hornet, Keat and Bretta hurried to the war hall, where the first messengers were already reporting about different disturbances in the deeper areas of the city, although the reason was unknown. And finally, Hachi and Ghost descended at a brisk pace to the lower levels. With his spider ability, Hachi was able to descend the walls without much trouble, being able to find the small cracks in the rock and wood to secure his legs. Ghost, on the other hand, made powerful leaps between structure and structure, some even 5 or 6 times his own height, but always falling with an elegance impossible for his size. Hachi. The ghost's voice caught the attention of the weaver, who looked up and saw 2 metallic objects flying gently towards her in full descent. The spider took it with its legs and opened its eyes with concern when it saw what it was. They were 2 of Ghost's hidden daggers. "No, I can't use this, it's my people, I can't hurt them." Hachi looked at him pleadingly, but Ghost's gaze was cold and immovable, something that awakened in the weavers a fear she never thought she would experience. "I can't guarantee that they think the same about you. But I. Ghost didn't return another response. "I didn't need to do it." The weaver could not ignore reality no matter how much she wanted to. Hachi looked at the daggers, knowing that Ghost's words were not without reason, but no less painful for that, just thinking about having to hurt someone. "Alright," he said, still with doubts. "But our priority is to know what is happening, we will not fight if it is not necessary." The weaver gave the ghost a withering look, who immediately understood her meaning. "Diaresis, these are my people, and I will protect them at any cost." Diaresis Ghost only nodded his head as they both placed their hoods over their heads to hide their identities. Once they reached the lower floors, they were in hostile territory. Hachi and Ghost landed on a surface in the lower levels where the screams, chaos, and commotion were most noticeable. They hid in the shadows, watching with concern everything that was happening. The revolt, made up mostly of civilians, was plunging into the upper areas of the city. There were several buildings on fire, bodies lying in the streets, but the injured were far greater than the dead. The civilians, armed with sticks and work tools, faced a cordon created by the local militia of weavers. Apparently, some officer was able to react quickly when everything broke out, since the news could not have reached the war room so quickly. "We have to move. Let's avoid the main streets." "I follow you." The weaver took the lead, and they both entered the darkest areas of the city, avoiding at all costs the groups of angry citizens who were marching determined to join the others who were already fighting at the front. Everyone, shouting angrily against the oppression of the wealthier classes and how all this was their fault. Although it was not precise information, they were at least able to determine that famine must have been the main driver of the outbreak of this revolt. It doesn't make sense. The rations were distributed throughout the city. How is this possible? Come on. We must continue searching. Where should we go? Ghost thought for a moment and an idea occurred to him. Where do they keep the food? There must be warehouses on each level of the city. I guess it's the best place to know what's going on. Do you know where they are? Yes, let's go. They are not far away. Once again, the two infiltrated deeper and deeper into the dark areas of the city, avoiding the increasingly infrequent angry citizen patrols. And finally they saw it, a huge structure that towered above the others, which had, among several notable things, a couple of grain silos. That was it. Over there. We are close. We must enter. Through the roof. Follow me. The weaver threw her cloth towards a surface and used it to close the distance incredibly quickly, being able to reach the roof of the structure almost immediately. Very different from Ghost, who did have to use his sharp claws to climb and avoid getting stuck in the spiderwebs that he found in his path. Something that took a long time. "You took your time," said the weaver, somewhat restless. "That fabric is too useful." Advantages of being a weaver. Now let's go. Let's not waste time. It didn't take them long to find an entrance, and they both entered the silent place, only to get an unpleasant surprise. One that they were both already imagining. The warehouse was completely empty. "It can't be, where are the rations?" she mentioned worriedly, while Ghost analyzed the floor of the building. "This place has been down for at least a week." "Impossible. That means then." The weaver's voice is interrupted when she hears the creak of a nearby door. They both turn around, attentive and with their hands on their hidden weapons, ready to face any enemy. However, the only thing that caused them was confusion when they saw that it was a very elderly weaver who, even with 6 of his 8 legs, had to use a cane in his hands. What are you doing here?" he asked angrily, but his figure did not show any threat, allowing Hachi and Ghost to relax. We just wanted something to eat, sir." Hachi spoke with an unusual politeness in that area, which earned a raised eyebrow from the old insect. "Are they tones or what? This place has been empty for almost a month. What rock have they been living under to not know that?" We're sorry. It's just that we heard that Sendero Verde had sent food. We thought we could get some." The old man just snorts angrily. "Yeah. The caravan arrived with food. But it never made it down here. Those bastards from the upper levels kept it all to themselves. You can't be. Those rations should have been distributed throughout the city. Ah, we all thought the same thing. And we look like idiots, believing that those royalists would care about us. They only care about filling their bellies and nothing else. Ghost looks at Hachi for a second. The old insect's words filled her with fury and helplessness. She wasn't upset by what he said, but by the facts. As a princess, it was her duty to care for her people, and she had failed them. For the most part, his fury was directed at himself, at his inability. However, his frustration and thoughts of self-blame were stopped when a friendly hand rested on his shoulder. Hachi turned his head and saw a large hand resting on his right shoulder. He looked up and met Ghost's face, who even behind those married eyes, was able to show his support. Something that the Weaver was grateful for at that moment. You two, if you want something to eat, you're going to have to join the rest. Here I can assure you that you will not find anything. It's okay, sir. Thank you. This time, it was Ghost's voice who had to be raised, as Hachi could only clench his teeth and fists in helplessness. Wondering why all this. The old insect left the place, at a pace much slower than any other. It was as if he was already in his last days. Maybe because of age, maybe because of starvation. Leaving behind a sepulchral silence. Are you okay? The ghost asked, trying to make the Weaver regain some composure. No, I'm not. This is my fault, all of this. Because of my inability. Ghost only remained silent, but still resting his hand on the Weaver's shoulder. It is my duty. Whether Hornet or I are the future queen, it is my responsibility, my people. And I failed them, and now everyone is suffering because of me, our fault because of me. It's not your fault. The time to intervene had arrived. Hachi looked up, trying to find comfort in the ghost's eyes. Ghost's expression was as grim as ever, but now some empathy peeked through his eye sockets. He, more than anyone else in these lands, knew what it was like to feel the weight of the people suffering. His own town. He was a boy. He knew that back then, there was nothing he could do to avoid such a fate. But that didn't make it any less painful. Still, if Ghost also knew something, it was how much that helplessness had consumed him. And the least he wanted was for Hachi to suffer something similar. However, Hachi lowered his gaze in defeat. The damage was already done. Weavers facing weavers in a pitched battle within their own city. Something like this had not happened in generations, and it was something that ate at her heart. However, he had to be strong, but how? The Weaver's eyes widened in embarrassment as she felt Ghost's other hand caress her head. The ghost wasn't quite sure what he was doing would work, but every time Keed tried to calm him down after a nightmare this way, it worked somehow. He supposed it might have a similar effect on her. And in part, he was right. The Weaver's anger and fury were gradually replaced by shame and a feeling of warmth. Having your crush treat you like a little girl isn't the most harmonious feeling of all, but Hachi knew Ghost well enough to know that what he did it from the heart. Although that didn't make it any less embarrassing. Little by little, the Weaver calmed down, and her grief became a haven of peace. His mind found calm in the caresses that the ghost provided between its horns, and the thoughts that clouded his mind were divided into more concrete problems with more specific solutions. Better? Yes, thanks. I'm glad to know that. I guess obfuscating won't help anything. Okay, we have to move. Do you have an idea what to do? The clue. If we want to know why this is happening, we have to go see Captain Dirge. Who did you entrust with the task of distributing the rations? Himself. Only he can give us a clue. Very good. To where? Above. The upper levels and could you stop stroking my head? It's a shameful thing. I'm sorry. He said as he concluded the gesture. Do you feel better? Yes, thanks. I'm glad to hear it. Come on, we don't have time to waste. Meanwhile, the situation was equally worrying in other areas of Deep Nest. Sun Ce, accompanied by a mob of frightened civilians, was heading towards the exit of the city. The news spread faster than the wind, and all those who feared for their lives and those of their loved ones preferred to approach the dark corridors of the area you remain in the city. The general did not take long to reach the outside of the city, where the camp of Mossy soldiers had been installed for their stay during these days, that the delegation would remain in Kaminosu City. However, everyone was alert, with their shields and stingers in hand, watching for the mob of insects escaping from the city, but completely ignoring them. General? Here. Sun Ce looked up from the crowd and saw one of his men calling out to him. The general was big and strong, and it was easy for him to make his way through the crowd that was running in disarray until he reached his soldiers, who were formed in an improvised shield wall formation. Sun Ce made his way through the shields until he finally reached the safety of the center, where the officers present were trying to make sense of all this chaos. General. What is happening? It all started too fast. I don't know, Lieutenant. Things just became chaotic on the lower floors. I don't know anything else. They are fleeing. Why? A civil outbreak apparently. We learned the deep nest was on the verge of collapse due to lack of food. But the rations that should have lessened the hostilities. It doesn't make sense. I don't understand it either, Lieutenant. Maybe they weren't enough. Maybe something else happened. What should we do, Captain? That was a very good question. We cannot intervene in Deep Nest's internal affairs. That would be seen as a possible attack, especially in these delicate times. Then we should leave as soon as possible. Where is Ghost-sama? That fool. Doing something stupid without a doubt. The lieutenant asked no more questions, more concerned about his own men than the situation in the kingdom. Sun Ce instead looked at the city again with concern. Then, he turned his gaze, only to find thousands of terrified faces, afraid of losing the place they called home for so long. The civilians who had fled, little by little, gathered in the vicinity. Sun Ce could only sigh at the thought that crossed his mind. Lieutenant, let 4 insects accompany me. For the rest, protect civilians and avoid any catastrophe. General. Do you plan to enter the city again? That's reckless. Could be. But I can't sit idly by and just wait. I understand, sir. Sergeant June. Take your men and protect the general with your life. Yes, sir. Exclaimed the aforementioned insect energetically. To the rest. You already know what to do. Underway. The general, followed by the 4 armed mosses, once entered the city towards the war room. Sun Ce thought about it for a few minutes and he had to protect this alliance to avoid another catastrophe. Another food war. Losing another member of your family. So his course was already set, protected by his soldiers going in, running against a current of insects that only wanted to flee, to save their lives. The war room was not far away, but it was a dangerous path as the conflicts of the growing civil war increasingly raised the levels of the city. What Sun Ce did not know was that those they were looking for would not sit idly by and wait for this crisis to resolve itself. In the middle of the war room, the Deep Nest leaders were engaged in a heated debate as reports rained down on them like a constant barrage of bad news. The indulgent ones have reached the 3rd level. Our forces are being outnumbered. The fire on the lower levels is spreading too quickly. It is only a matter of time before they reach the higher levels. Several sectors have fallen. Captain Dirge requests reinforcements in Subsector 8. The messenger's reports did not stop while 3 heads did their best to find a solution. Those bastards. We should teach them what happens when they challenge us. A very upset Nos kept calling for violence and bloodshed. It's our town. We can't do that. While the Hornet tried to call common sense. Mother, there must be a reason. Those ration loads can't have simply disappeared. I know, my daughter. But we don't know what could have happened. We knew this was happening, but we didn't count on someone sabotaging the delivery of rations. It is useless, my kingdom. We have tried everything. We promised him we would give rations assigned to the higher levels, but he just doesn't listen. Those bastards don't deserve your mercy. Give me the order and I will make the weight of my scythe fall on them. Nosk don't know this is not the time to think about killing each other. We have to make the people listen to us. That's what we've been doing all this time. But they don't want to listen to us. The moment for words is now over. Now is the time to use your fist. That's enough, General Nosk. Hera's voice dropped the argument. We cannot use force against our people, but we are running out of options. Mother. General. Wait outside for instructions. Yes, Your Majesty. The enormous insect nodded with a greeting and turned around slowly while giving the Red Weaver a macabre smile of victory. Something that Hornet viewed with resentment and contempt. Mother, you can't hear it. That insect is obsessed with the damn war and the dead. It may be, my daughter. But its track record speaks for itself and its effectiveness. Hornet just gritted his teeth. He had no way to refute that. Just there must be another way. I pray to the gods that it be so. Where is your sister? Hachi went down to the lower levels. He's trying to figure out what's going on. That fool. How do you come up with something so reckless? Identical to you, I suppose. The Grand Matriarch could only let out a smile at the comment, but then her expression turned dark as she remembered the problem at hand. Hera tried to think of a solution when the sudden arrival of a messenger caught the attention of both weavers. My lady. The insurgents breached level 8. Captain Dirge, request reinforcements immediately. They won't be able to resist much longer. Demons. We're running out of time. Hornet, prepare the Red Guard. We have to do something before. My lady. A second messenger entered the place suffocated. What's happening? General Nosk left the palace with several reserve forces. They're heading to level 9 to support Captain Dirge. Demons. Mother. I'm sorry, Hornet. Call all the Red Guard. And bring my needles. Chap. 27, The Awakening of the Beast. Hornadono in the halls of Deep Nest's palace, the voice of a foreign insect, stopped the weaver's walk. Gidono, Bredadono. They have to leave the kingdom immediately. I'll tell an escort that the… No. The beetle's voice stopped her. We want to help. If there is any way to do it, please tell us. Hornet looked at both women with a mixture of surprise and bewilderment. Why would foreigners want to intervene in the kingdom's problems? Much more problems of this type. Even so. I don't know how they could help. We have to know where Hachi and Ghost Dono are. And if something happens to General Sun Ce, it could cause a break in diplomatic relations. Demons. Why did this have to happen now? The weaver tenses and clenches her teeth in helplessness. His gaze wanders for a moment over the dark floor while his mind fills with frustration. Everything finally seemed to be falling into place somehow. Why did this happen? What did he do wrong? Hornet's moment of self-blame was interrupted, however, when a large hand rested on his shoulder. The weaver looked up, still with clenched teeth and a frown, and focused her gaze on Keed's 6 pairs of eyes, who did her best to return a firm but hopeful look. Everything is going to be fine. Somehow. I'll go find Ghost and his sister. Let Bretta go with you. He knows how to heal wounds and field surgery. Hornet looks back at him for a few seconds, still doubtful of such a decision, but lacking options and the strength to oppose it, she simply lowered her head and focused her gaze on the beetle. Who, although nervous, did her best to show some courage. I'll do my best, Princess Hornet. The Khan finally gives in to decisions that did not belong to her and lets out a long sigh in emotional defeat. She looks up and nods, still not entirely convinced. Keed was still Lupu's daughter. If something were to happen to him, Deep Nest could be doomed. On the other hand, Keed herself did not wait another second and ran towards the darkness of the palace, disappearing from both of their sights like a ghost in the darkness of the night. Without leaving any trace or shadow. Hornet took a second breath, now focusing his gaze on Bretta, who remained at his side. His look said a lot, things that were not necessary to explain with words. Difficult times were approaching, but Bretta did not back down from the gesture. No matter how much his wobbly legs told him to run for his life. Come on. We must warn the rest of the guard. I'm coming after you, Hornet-sama. Meanwhile, racing against the tide of panicked civilians, General Sun Ce and his guard moved deeper and deeper into the city. 2 of his guards were in front, with their shields raised, pushing away the tide of bugs. Some crashed into them and fell, but they couldn't stop to help them, not in this crisis. More so, when a huge figure emerged from the war room, followed by a numerous entourage of weavers covered in jet black women. Matriarch Hera. The Great Weaver stops for a moment and sees the warrior approaching at a fast pace. They stop for a moment, something they would not do if it were not for their current possible economic and nutritional dependence. But that didn't remove the frown from his face. General. I'm afraid I don't have time to talk to you right now. The affairs of the kingdom press my time. I ask you to leave the city and return to Sendero Verde if necessary. Sun Ce finally stopped a few steps away from the matriarch, but his elite force of black weavers would not allow him to get too close. Not in this crisis. Not by a foreigner. However, neither this gesture nor the anger on the Great Weaver's face would calm her warrior spirit. My men are regrouping the civilians outside the city. Yes, if something happened. We will take you to Sendero Verde. But in the meantime, there are things that need to be done. Hera's eyes narrow slightly, judging the words and actions of this unknown warrior, very different from his followers in black, who showed true confusion at the attitude and weight of the general's words from other lands. What do you have in mind? Asked a matriarch still with doubts. There must be something that can be done. Hera hesitates for a moment, then speaks. We knew this could happen. We tried to ration meals, but discontent was increasing. However, after you arrived and the rations were delivered, the discontent should have been subdued. Why then? Are you sure the rations were delivered? The general's comment brought out some expressions of surprise and fear in those present, but Hera only returned his gaze with narrowed, accusatory eyes. What are you implying, General? I'm not insinuating anything, I'm just analyzing the facts. Tempting the fury of the Deepnest matriarch is not wise, and even those who have never seen her in person knew it. It was common sense and Hallownest. General knowledge. Something that Sun Ce was ignoring, looking at the regent with the same defiant look that she gave him. Mother. The sudden voice of the Red Weaver broke the tension between both insects, turning their heads to the peculiar duo leaving the war hall towards the group gathered just in front. General. What are you doing here? Hornet asked, seeing Sun Ce with the rest of the weavers. That. Did you think I would run away with my tail between my legs? Bad time for your jokes. Yes, with you it is never a good time. Seeing Hornet irritated really wasn't very difficult, although her anger with this insect from distant lands was different. Especially for a mother who is capable of noticing details so small that not even her own. This is not the time to laugh, mother. The weaver mentioned, still angry. I know, my daughter. I know. He takes a deep breath, then returns to his steely expression. Very good, General. I will listen to your words. Hornet, take some troops and head to the warehouses on level 11. We will distribute the leftover rations in the lowest sectors. Are you sure, ma'am? Maybe they are not enough. One of the weavers in black mentioned. Then we will use those of all the higher levels if necessary. I just want the person responsible for such a failure to appear before me and give me a good justification for their mistakes. It's okay, mother. I'll go right away. General. Can his men help the princess? Count on us, Queen Hera. But mother. No verbal response was needed from the matriarch. An emotionless look was enough for Hornet to understand that he had to remain silent and obey the order. And while he might grumble about that, he had to obey his command. The Red Weaver only shot a withering look at Sun Ce, who shrugged his shoulders as he was not to blame for such a decision. Which irritated the already grumpy Weaver a little more. However, orders are orders, and not even 2 minutes passed before everyone went their separate ways. They had to stop this madness at all costs. Meanwhile, in the deeper areas of Deep Nest, Hachi and Ghost moved at a brisk pace towards the upper levels. Mistaking the straggling choleric insects was not a difficult task given their abilities, but the numbers were increasing. And the spaces available to hide were scarce. And forcing his way through would definitely be the last option. Any ideas? Asked the Ghost. Just a couple more levels, but there are too many. Alternate routes. Some but none that you fit into. I'm not fat. I'm not talking about fat. That was a compliment in every sense of the word, accompanied by a somewhat mischievous look from the Weaver. A compliment that Ghost didn't understand at all and just cocked his head to the side wondering what he meant. Hachi could only sigh in disappointment and shake his head. Let's continue. Wait. The Weaver flinched a little at the words and her face reddened at Ghost's grip on her forearm. However, when he turned around and saw the Ghost looking suspiciously at his surroundings, he knew something was not right. What's happening? Asked a restless Weaver. Follow me. The dong sought. Grrrrrrrrrrr. There was little use in trying to reason with him. Much less when he ran off to who knows where without waiting. Hachi, who was previously in the lead, had to hurry to catch up with him before losing him from his field of vision, wondering what was happening to him or what he had seen for such a sudden change of attitude. After a not very steep run, he ran into Ghost, crouched behind a corner and motionless. Ghost. What are you? His words were interrupted when the Ghost hurriedly turned around and placed a finger in front of his mouth as a sign for him to remain silent. Hachi obeyed immediately and slowly approached where he was. And when close enough, several voices could be heard. Voices of conspiracy. Is everything ready? It is only a matter of time before they reach the higher levels. Good. They already know what to do. They must intercept the red one before it reaches its destination. What do you want us to do with it when we're done? Let her fail, but we need her alive. And what do we do if the white one appears? Finish her. It's a hindrance to our plans. She must have stayed dead. This is just a setback. The plans remain unchanged. May the light of the soul guide us. The voices quieted and the footsteps receded into the distance while the figures to which they belonged entered grottos and empty alleys. Ghost and Hachi stayed hidden. Ghost, silent as he thought about what he had heard while holding the Weaver's shoulder tightly, who was tempted to burst into the meeting of those bastards and decapitate each of them. Damn, they are to blame for everything, he said with indignation and rage. Why did you stop me, Ghost? We should have killed them here and now. The jump into the unknown is foolish. Hachi can only grit his teeth in helplessness. His expression makes no attempt to hide his anger and Ghost just silently analyzes it. Those traitors mentioned something about stopping the red one. They were probably referring to Hornet. Apparently, the princess had a plan that could stop this crisis. However, ending the white one were the words that filled him with rage. The only difference was that Ghost was still unable to express his emotions openly, but the fury was still unleashed within his chest and mind. The big question was why did they need Hornet alive and not Hachi? He asks that for the moment, he should wait. Fence. I really didn't expect to find them here. Both Hachi and Ghost turned around quickly upon hearing the appearance of a new voice. The voice of a huge figure that was slowly approaching without being detected. One that, despite its eyes, was as silent as the void itself. General Nosk, I'm glad to see you. Listen. Something bad is happening. A group of insects that. The Weaver tried to speak, but was interrupted when the figure of Ghost slowly rose and stood right in the middle, without looking away from the colossal insect, which stopped walking when it saw how the Ghost stood in its way in such a threatening way. Like a cobra spreading its membranes to warn of danger. Oh. Calm down, General Ghost. I'm glad I found them. With all this chaos. How did you get here? The Ghost asked without hesitation. Well. When I was informed that Princess Hachi had come to the lower levels with you, General Ghost, I knew that I should not stand idly by and ensure her safety. It's my duty after all. Something didn't add up and that was something that Hachi was already beginning to suspect. Something that Ghost had been convinced of since he saw the enormous insect for the first time at the welcome banquet, and that had been confirmed in their chance encounter in the dark corridors of the war hall. Something that contradicted a lot between the current situation in the kingdom and the strange Machiavellian smile that Nosk wore on his face. However, while some tried to find answers, others had the misfortune of seeing the misfortune and loss with their own eyes. Years of sacrifice ruined in a second. Hera, matriarch of Deep Nest, ran alongside her guard to try to quell the revolt that had spread so quickly from the lower levels. How was a mystery to the regent, but those questions took a backseat when she saw with her own eyes the misfortune that spread across the entire width of level 9. By the ancestors, what happened? The voice of one of her followers could not be controlled, while the newcomers watched a disastrous panorama with terror. Instead of finding a revolt, angry citizens, and a military cordon trying to contain them, they found a massacre, hundreds of lifeless bodies on the ground, and the local guard doing their best to help those whose lives still hung in the balance. Life and death. Hera was not able to react immediately, despite having seen such scenarios before in his life, when war ravaged every corner of Hallownest. Long before the light of the Emperor illuminated the future and hopes. However, this time, even the most brutal of the warriors stood petrified before the scene. Perhaps because age had softened his heart, perhaps because it was his own people who were the victims of such misfortune. "Your Highness." The familiar voice brought her out of her trance as she turned her head to the side, still in disbelief. A large arachnid was approaching at a fast pace, limping on one leg and with a large bandage around one of its lost eyes. One who approached the group and whose passage was allowed by the weavers in black until he knelt before the matriarch. Even with the clear shock still reflected on his face. Captain Dirge. That what the hell happened here? That it was General Noske appeared out of nowhere and just continued down to the lower levels. Pen, we thought they were going to help us control the citizens, but they just. Calm down, Captain. I need all the details. Now. The insect shook at the fury of the matriarch, who just hearing Nosk's name, felt how fury invaded her body at the betrayal. You needed answers, I needed them desperately. Captain Dirge could only see in shock the fury that his queen was overflowing, but it was not the time to falter despite that. He just took a deep breath and spoke more calmly. General Nosk and his troops devastated everything without stopping towards the lower levels. They pushed everyone out of their way, whether soldiers or civilians. They didn't ask, they didn't stop, they continued on their way. Hera's expression changed at these words. An expression that very few had seen, but that made some hearts flutter with fear. The matriarch's eyes narrowed in fury, her hands tightened on her needles, her deadly teeth bared for all to see. The beast had awakened once again. Chap. 28 Betrayal. Nosk, what the hell have you done? Hachi's voice held an anger that Ghost had not felt before. She wasn't stupid, and all she had to do was weigh him a little to be able to connect the dots. Even unaware of the genocide that Nosk had carried out at the highest levels, his sudden appearance, right at that moment, and that defiant attitude, were sufficient proof of his complicity with the tragedy that Deep Nest was facing. I'm just fulfilling the natural law of Deep Nest, that's all. What are you talking about, bastard? The weaver asked angrily. Of course, how would a princess know what I'm talking about? He spoke with a high tone of irony. Always in the comfort of the palace, without any worry. Without knowing what it's like to go to sleep with your stomach eating your own sanity. With your limbs contracting in weakness. With your lungs doing the impossible to keep you alive. Of course you don't understand, you can't understand what you don't know. Those times ended long ago. My mother was in charge of eliminating the famine in this kingdom, long before I was even born. What you say doesn't make sense. Nosk doesn't respond. In fact, he remains with an apathetic face as he looks at the princess. More than anger, you only see disappointment. Because. I guess in the end she was right about you. She. It was a thought that passed through the minds of both Ghost and Hachi. And what bothers me the most is that he was right all this time. I thought you would realize, but you are as wrong as your mothers. What point do you want to get to with all this? You did not understand my words, princess. I do not hate the Dark Ages because of the hunger, desperation, and mistreatment I suffered. I do not hate the days of suffering or those I lost. After all, it was fair. This statement left the pair completely confused. Fair? How can you call something fair like that? Because it is for an abomination like me, it's only fair that something like this happens. Because he was weak. And the weak deserve no mercy. None of them. Rage overcame the general as the tip of his scythe struck the ground hard, creating a dull echo that drowned out any other sound in the place. At the same time, hundreds of faces peeked out from the shadows and looked at them with judging eyes. The perfect place to give a speech. I was weak and pathetic. An abomination that crawled in the darkest sewers of Deep Nest. But I refused to just give myself up for dead. If others saw me as a monster, then I would become the monster they thought I was. I would be the strongest. The one who would rise above all. The supreme predator. And only the strongest have that right. Can you even hear yourself? You have lost your mind. Yeah. I did it. His response was forceful. I did it the moment Deep Nest became the laughingstock of Hallownest. The moment we humble ourselves before that weakling worm and his words of peace and prosperity. Deep Nest should have conquered Hallownest. And I wanted to be part of that glorious moment taken away by sentimentality and garbage false promises, and look at us now, just we are the shit that crawls at the bottom of these caverns. You're crazy. Affirmed the Weaver. You're just a bastard addicted to war and killing your whole life. You've lived with that bloodlust in your eyes. Do you really think that you will be a good leader for Deep Nest? He asked, confused. Don't say stupid things. I don't have the time or the conviction to do that. For many years, I thought that Hera had it, but it turned out to be a great disappointment, and I never expected it from you. However, I do know someone who has the nerve to do things the way she does. That who are you talking about? Oh, I'm sure you know. The Weaver's brow furrowed for several seconds while her mind plotted to find the answer. However, his eyes widened with fear at the possible truth. Hornet. I see you realized she just needs a little push to understand it. He mentioned while smiling macabrely. Kill them. However, in the upper levels of Deep Nest, plans were not developing as planned at all. The sound of metal on metal being struck relentlessly saturated the passages of the 11th level of the city when Hornet and Sun C's group were intercepted by a large group of hooded weavers. Stingers and holes collided with each other, and the muffled sounds of weapons crying out for death and blood echoed in the surroundings. While those desperately trying to stop the riots wondered what was happening. Who are you? Hornet's angry voice rose amid the commotion as his needle and that of one of his assailants collided furiously. Both began to struggle for supremacy and strength, while the Weaver in red could find no other emotion in her challenger than determination. We are the ones who will bring glory to Deep Nest once again. Said her assailant, as convinced as she herself was. Hornet erupted in even more rage at these statements, rotating the blade of his weapon, causing his opponent to lose his balance. When Hornet's needle rose again, its deadly edge found the opening in the Weaver's neck, instantly decapitating her in a clean cut that barely shed any blood. Remind me to never make you angry. In the middle of the battle, Hornet rotated his gaze, seeing the Green Path general who had followed his group, brandishing his weapon back, cleaning the blood of a recently slain enemy. Do you really feel like making jokes in a situation like this? The group of 5 weavers set both of them as targets. Hornet stood on guard, waiting for their attack, but before they could even do anything, a deadly severed sword extended to its maximum capacity, laying waste to the area in front of the Red Weaver, cutting the attackers in half like its thin blades. Bamboo retreated. Only to then be picked up in a strong metallic crash on the hand of its wearer. It wasn't a joke. Sun Ce mentioned, before looking at the Weaver with cold and worried eyes. Hornet, we have to end this as soon as possible. Surrounded and outnumbered 3-1. I am open to suggestions. I don't mean that. This attack was too timely to be a mere coincidence. Do you think I didn't notice? Suddenly, a new group of masked women targeted the 2 warriors. There were 4 of them, with needles in hand, ready to pierce the body of the Red Weaver. Hornet analyzed the situation in a matter of seconds and gave a small jump while her needle began to dance around her and her numerous limbs began to shape the fabric that came out of her body. Adiro. The fine white silk was thrown around the Weaver like an invisible cocoon. The strands rotated at such speed that you could only observe the reflection of the trails that they left behind and the gusts of wind that made a perfect sphere around them. An inexperienced eye would not have been able to see what had happened, but Sun Ce's eye saw it all as a beautiful dance, lethal and elegant. When Hornet's thin feet touched the ground delicately and the 4 attackers remained motionless behind him, time stopped. Until the body of the masked men began to fall in pieces on the ground, now being nothing more than amorphous masses of flesh than they once were. Sun Ce just lets out a whistle of shock at this. You have some pretty interesting tricks. This is a distraction. He commented, ignoring the general's compliment. His attacks are very passive. They just want to keep us. Above all because the largest number of objectives are located behind our backs. Cutting our way back. So I guess your real objective is somewhere else. Suddenly, Hornet's eyes widen as he solves the equation. Finding the missing piece. The riots, the famine, its older brother, the war. They all aimed at a single goal. Hachi mother. Hornet tried to retreat immediately, but overcoming a barrier of dozens of armed enemies would not be an easy task, much less a quick one. Hornet's needle was stopped by a wall of legs, web, and needles. One that made him back away, even when Sun Ce tried to help her. But in vain. Damn. We have to get out of here. My sister and my mother are in danger. I wouldn't worry so much about that. How can you be so calm? Because Ghost is with her. Hornet looked at the general for a second. She had tested the Ghost's strength herself, but she doubted it would be enough. Not against an army. Not against Nosk. Hornet could only clench his fists and clench his teeth helplessly, knowing there was nothing he could do. Not if she was still trapped in this false war. Knowing that their loved ones were in mortal danger. However, there wasn't much he could do. What both she and the eldest son did not know was that, above their false war, a scheming being was contemplating everything with peculiar enthusiasm. She was the architect of all this ruse and the one who pulled the strings. The one who managed to manipulate the war-hungry brain of Deep Nest's most lethal general, with promises of glory and unmemorable time, appealing to the glorious past that he longed for so much. Adia-sama. The preparations are ready. He mentioned a hooded woman hidden in the shadows. Excellent news. The insect, who had a glass full of very good wine in her hand, threw everything on the floor as if it were simple dirty water, only to let the glass fall later with a throbbing sound of broken glass. He turned around, pulling out from under his cloak a strange device that emanated a bright white light. A lantern, whose vibrant power implied that it was not just light that it emanated. Sticking to a wall, an immense figure shook angrily, tied in chains, and gagged with an iron frame that devoured all his words and attempts to scream. No matter how strong or powerful she was, no one would be able to break those chains or free the monster that was fighting for freedom. Don't worry, I know you're eager to do your part, but look on the bright side, you don't have to wait any longer. His tone demonstrated vibrant joy, but his intentions hid a macabre purpose. The being thrashed and growled in vain and could do nothing when Adia brought that strange artifact closer to the creature's eyes. He tried to resist, but that pale light was too intoxicating, like the song of a siren who longs to sink the sailors to devour them in her fantasies. Then the being's pupils expanded to their maximum capacity, as if it were a trance, until its vain attempts to escape were completely stopped. Adia smiled at that, and with her snap of her fingers, several hooded weavers approached and removed the chains and restraints from the creature, who now seemed to be in some sort of mind control. Without uttering a grunt or any word, just waiting. I like it that way, good boy. Now go and get rid of that meddlesome Sendero Verde general. The being finally stood up, revealing itself to be almost twice the size of Adia herself and several times larger than her. In his hand, a colossal scythe which, unlike Nosk's, was clearly seen to be the front leg of some other creature. A colossal mantis surely. And with a heavy weight, he left the one who controlled his mind behind, saying only 2 words. Alien kill. Chap. 29, let's dance with blood. Remind you that the songs are to play in the background while you continue reading. Let's finish this, kill them. Nosk's command echoed through the dark caverns. His icy words showed no interest in those two who, in his eyes, were not worth his time. Princess Hachi was not Hornet. She was not the great warrior her sister could become. Dozens of hooded weavers emerged from the shadows and charged at the Khan and that green path bug. He had high hopes for him, but when he ran into him in the halls of the war hall and saw those dead, emotionless eyes, he lost interest completely. Now, at least 24 needles were falling from the skies toward Hachi and Ghost, who were carrying neither their needle nor their father's katana. Only those small hidden ghost daggers, which would not be able to overcome such an overwhelming force of enemies. Nosk saw them with total lack of interest and turned to head towards his true objective. Who could give a real fight to? The roar shook the now catacombs of Deep Nest, macabrely decorated with the screams of dozens of voices taking their last breath, while the peculiar sound of the shells being broken into pieces by a sharp weapon fell to the ground like the coldest hail. Nosk stopped dead at such a sound. Atonic, unable to believe what he had heard, those were not the sounds he was expecting. The enormous insect turned around slowly, only to look in amazement at what such a scenario revealed to them. In his mind, impossible. That insect from Green Path, the one whose interest completely disappeared after their first encounter, was in a crouching position, slowly rising as the wind shook its black cloak, carrying with it the small drops of blood that dripped from its daggers. Once pathetic in the sight of Deep Nest's great general. Around him, 10 no 15 18 bodies torn to pieces, devoid of life, severed as if they had been cut by the executioner's sharp blades. Hachi's face, of shock and fear, was a creepy complement to the scene as he looked with fearful eyes and frantic breathing at the one Nosk had previously considered his companion. The Green Path warrior was finally able to stand fully and his vacant gaze fell on Nosk as if his reason for living had become ending his life. And that look, previously insipid and tasteless, now overflowed with rage and hatred. Nosk, he could only feel his blood boiling at that, while a sinister smile appeared involuntarily on his face. Why, yes, that's what I meant. Nosk's words seemed wrapped in delirium and his own bloodlust as his body finally turned fully to face the ghost. His figure imposed itself, his hands pressed his scythe in front, who with a simple circular movement split the air in front of him, releasing gusts of wind that shook even the very foundations of the buildings right next to him. This insect was at a level far beyond what Ghost had ever faced, and he knew it. The ghost, for the first time in his life, raised his hand from under his cloak and removed the clasp that had the garment attached to his body. Tella, which took flight, dragged by the wind of calamity to wherever its capricious walk pushed it. Revealing, for the first time to the eyes of those present, what the ghost was hiding under that robe. The latent shell, toned and looking like it wanted to burst before the muscles that pressed it. One who proudly showed the hundreds of scars that their life had left them. Hachi, behind him, seeing in shock the enormous scar that started from his shoulder to the middle of his back. Nosk, seeing the same scar on his chest, which stopped in the middle of his epigastrium. A living being should not be alive after having suffered damage of that type. Unlike Nosk, whose heavy body was supported by most of his legs and only 2 limbs brandished his deadly scythe, Ghost showed his forearms open, with daggers hidden in each hand, perfectly resembling the pose of the Vitruvian man. While his chest inflated at the colossal amount of air that his nostrils demanded. Only to be expelled from his mouth in a heavy, almost guttural sound. Ha ha ha, I hope you don't disappoint me. Nosk's voice brought several of those present out of their fear, Hachi included, when they felt the earth tremble before the footsteps of the colossal being, whose titanic scythe rose above his head, ready to cut in two that bastard who had the audacity to challenge Deep Nest's major general. Hachi, now able to control the momentary fear he felt when he saw the insect he loved massacring his enemies, tried to shout at him. Tell him not to confront Nosk. Let him run away, even if it meant leaving her behind. After all, she was the one they wanted. He tried to shout it, but no words escaped his mouth due to the commotion, and Nosk was already a few steps away from Ghost, with the deadly scythe beginning its journey towards its objective. No one ever had been able to stop Ghost's scythe, and the Princess of Deep Nest, unable to warn him, could only see from a few steps how the one she loved would lose his life in front of him. His eyes. Or maybe not. Ghost did not tremble before the Reaper, and his 4 limbs in unison launched themselves on the weapon of his opponent, who, as surprised as the White Weaver and the rest of the traders, saw in amazement how the unstoppable scythe had been intercepted and effectively stopped in its tracks. Its trajectory, even when its deadly curved edge dangerously pinked the Ghost's face, threatening to remove an eye at the slightest mistake. However, this frame of just a millisecond that everyone could see was left behind in the infinite timeline before Ghost stepped aside. His integrity was still not safe, even when he was able to stop the unstoppable. His hands danced subtly, directing his opponent's weapon towards the hard stone floor, while his free daggers saw the opportunity to attack the arachnid. However, Nosk possessed impossible reflexes, and his strength unearthed his weapon from the ground, forcing Ghost to retreat before the back of the metal handle hit him. A move that left enough space between him and his opponent to rethink the way of conducting this fight. But, when Ghost assumed a combat stance, ready for the duel to the death, Nosk seemed not to move, his face full of amazement. He raised his hand and gently ran the tips of his claws over his mask, which now had a crack running along his left cheekbone. But instead of feeling angry about this, his psychopathic laughter only increased his satisfaction. Yes. I've been waiting for this for years. Now, his manic expression turned in Ghost's direction. I hope you don't disappoint me. Behind the Ghost's back, Hachi could only watch as the 2 warriors launched themselves against each other in a tornado of attacks and spins that devastated everything in their heaviness. Parting the wind as if it were blows to reality itself, however, she could not stay watching such a display of martial savagery when a step behind her reminded her of the precariousness of her situation. Hachi turned away, but not before taking 2 of the needles of the massacred weavers in his hands, facing the 30 or more hooded weavers who were getting closer and closer, surrounding it in a semicircular formation. He couldn't count on Ghost, as he wouldn't be able to help him in this situation. He was on his own. He just hoped that the wound in his abdomen was healed enough to keep up. However, at higher levels nest deep. Kill. A shrill, guttural voice shook the space where Hornet and Sun C struggled to overcome their ambushers. Both the Green Path General and the Khan of Deep Nest looked up, only to see a colossal creature fall from the heights. Careful. They both jumped in opposite directions at the beetle's scream, falling on opposite sides as that thing fell right in the middle, shaking the very foundations of the caverns and raising a large amount of dust and dirt. Neither Hornet nor Sun C wasted any time, and both immediately stood up in the face of the obvious danger, watching as the colossal insect rose from the dust. One, twice as tall as the Weaver and much more imposing than the general. Hornet clenched his fist and teeth once again in helplessness as he watched how the setbacks only accumulated in this well-planned tetra of his enemies. His gaze ahead, he now saw with rage the colossal warrior and his deadly scythe. One who, with red and erratic eyes, looked in his direction. Hornet could feel the strength emanating from that subject. He wasn't someone you wanted to underestimate, and his slow, heavy movements belied the brutality with which he jumped at them just a second ago. As if it were a compressed spring ready to unleash all its power. However, the Weaver's surprise was great when such a being simply turned its back on her, facing its true objective. Sun Ce, ignorant of the Red Weaver's situation, could do nothing but put himself on guard when he felt those heavy, raceless eyes pointed at him. Why he was the reason for his fury and not his companion was a mystery, but a mystery that he did not have time to solve when he saw how that colossal insect launched itself towards him with a fury and speed that he would previously have thought impossible not to be capable of. See it with your own eyes. Kill. The colossal insect exclaimed as it lunged with unbridled fury at its target. Sun Ce waited for the attack and his extendable sword shook violently as he felt the strength of the colossal warrior enveloped by the most unbridled anger. A blow so brutal that it caused the eldest son to fly several meters until he crashed against the walls of the underground chamber. Sun Ce felt every fiber of his being compressed by the impact, but he was resilient enough not to faint from the blow, even as his limbs trembled from the overwhelming pain he now felt. Knowing that if he tried to stop another of those attacks again, he would probably lose his sword and his own life. I'm Sidono. Hornet screamed at such brutality, just as Sun Ce hit the walls of the underground chamber. It didn't take her long to act and try to help him, but the flash of a sharp blade made her turn to the side, forcing her to raise her needle to stop the swift attack of a shadow that came from who knows where. An attack so fast that it did not allow the Weaver in red to acquire a balanced position before the momentum forced her to retreat and roll on the ground several steps in the opposite direction. This wouldn't be something that would put her down, and she stood up with only a couple of minor scrapes as she glared angrily at whoever had attacked her without warning. An insect. Apparently female, with a branching crack over the left socket of her mask, carrying in her hand a weapon from lands outside the kingdom. The crescent-bladed koppish, ideal for breaking defenses and causing precise cuts, bleeding your enemies. And although Hornet didn't know it, the apparent mastermind behind all of this. You're not going anywhere, little princess. Chap. 30 Despair. The sound of metal echoed again and again in the darkest caverns of Deep Nest. Ghost fought with every ounce of his being to keep the monstrosity that loomed before him at bay. An insect guided only by its insatiable thirst for violence. Nosk was ecstatic with the pleasure of finally facing again such a worthy rival, like those that the era of the Great Wars put in his path. All imposing warriors who had earned the respect or fear of their followers, all decapitated and their preserved heads macabrely decorating the place that the manic insect called home. Nosk's side had the complete advantage in this lopsided fight. Ghost's daggers were deadly, but too small in comparison. The ghost had to risk crossing the threshold between his safety and certain death to even attempt to land a blow on his opponent. If only he had his father's katana with him. Ha ha ha. Yes. This was what I was looking for. The arachnid's manic laughter resonated as loud as the impacts of his scythe, saturating the caverns with his guttural voice almost devoid of sanity. His eyes, wide open, unable to look away from this mysterious warrior who with only a few knives dared to face him. And yet, be able to stand firm against the use of all his strength. Ghost gave his all to keep up the pace. Unlike his small daggers, Nosk's scythe only needed a simple contact to cause a mortal wound. His eyes, although empty, did not miss the slightest detail, allowing his body to react in time before Nosk was able to develop the full movement of his attacks. Time, in which he had to decide to retreat or attack, the first option being the most viable in almost all cases. However, grave news began to fracture his concentration as a searing pain began to weaken his body. It had only been a few days since Hornet had pierced his abdomen, and although it had healed, it still had a long way to go before it was completely healed. A pain that, although I could ignore it, was still present. But there was another problem that made him dangerously look back. Hachi, using his 2 stingers, maintained his position like a stone fortress while dozens of needles headed towards his body. The attacks were so constant and uninterrupted that the Weaver in white barely had time to deflect one attack before another pounced on her. Of course, giving him no opportunity to fight back. Hachi was a masterful warrior, forged by the harsh training of her own mother, the beast. But she wasn't Hornet. The Weaver in white was not born for war, and her silk was more delicate and fine than her sister's. A silk capable of creating works of art, but that could not be used for war due to its fineness and lack of resistance. Even though her appearance was much more similar to her mother than her sister. Do not get distracted in a duel. Ghost barely had time to look at Hachi and see how little by little she was overwhelmed, but going to help her was not an option, since Nosk's scythe knew neither mercy nor fatigue. Every time the ghost turned its head to see the Weaver, a dangerously devastating cut passed close to its face or limbs. He couldn't lose concentration or his story would end right there. But cruel fate had other plans. Ai. Ghost's heart stopped for a millisecond when he heard the scream coming from behind him. That voice was the only one I didn't want to hear scream out of everyone present. It was too much to ignore. Ghost turned his head, not caring about anything else around him, only to watch in terror as the White Weaver let out her pain through her vocal cords, while the edge of the needle of one of the masked women made a hole in her defense, severing two of his left arms on the spot. Hachi's blood splattered his beautiful white robe, and the crimson of death began to stain the garment, as well as his own essence that escaped from his body. The stinger that she carried in that hand fell to the ground with a resounding sound, and she could do nothing when with a kick she fell to the ground surrounded by enemies. Hachi now lay on the ground, with the pain of the loss of two of his limbs, accompanying the pain of the wound in his abdomen, the internal damage of which had not yet fully healed. All while dozens of needles approached to finish her off, without her, exhausted, being able to do anything about it. Ghost saw it all in camera lens, and part of him collapsed when he saw how the only insect that was able to stir something in his heart now lay prostrate on the ground in front of the doors of death. He turned around to go save her but. Brave error. Ghost felt an icy breath, fetid with death behind him, he could barely turn around to see how the Reaper materialized in blood, and exoskeleton raised his scythe at a distance that he would not be able to evade, in a posture that would not be able to block the all. I couldn't escape that. Nosk's scythe descended in an elliptical motion, ending horizontally. Ghost raised his daggers, and although his weapons were able to stop most of the attack, the deadly tip of the scythe ended up embedding in his chest a few millimeters from his heart. The ghost growled, but no scream of pain escaped his mouth as he watched his enemy with growing rage and helplessness. An arachnid whose satisfaction only increased his macabre laughter while the combat became more and more dangerous. To the point of wanting to enjoy every damn second of this delight of blood. In one swift motion, Nosk retracted his weapon, disengaging the tip of his scythe from his opponent's chest. He could end it there and now. But he wanted to enjoy the moment and the one who had given him such a worthy battle. His scythe spun on its axis, and its blunt side lunged at Ghost with all its might. The Ghost tried to block it, but the arms on its injured side did not respond. Ghost received the impact, and his exoskeleton fractured dangerously on his ribs, while his body was brutally thrown against the walls of the caverns. His head received a brutal blow, but somehow, his consciousness remained active. The Ghost tried to stand up as it felt Nosk's heavy footsteps approaching. His hands were unresponsive, and his eyesight was not able to maintain a panoramic view of the situation, however he was not looking at his wounded body, nor at his unresponsive arms. He did not even look at the enemy who had left him in that state, and now he was approaching to finish the work, none of that his eyes only looked at the weaver of white cloth who was lying on the ground, trying to get up. All the needles that would end his life were already pounced on his body. There was nothing he could do. Both in the deep catacombs and on the lower levels, the situation was not at all favorable for the defenders of order. Hornet did not hesitate to attack this despicable switch that stood in her way, but she had enough skill to stop her. Adia brandished the koppish in a way Hornet had never seen before. More than a sword, it acted like a hook, slipping through his strands of thread and cutting them with overwhelming ease. Any attack that the weaver attempted through the use of her silk was neutralized even before being executed. She was not able to reach her needle either, since her small and agile body like her own, gave her enough skills to be at a similar level to the second most infallible warrior in all of Deep Nest. However, its most dangerous object, without a doubt, was this strange street lamp that it carried on its other arm. There had already been several occasions that its bright light blinded Hornet on more than one occasion, adapted to living in the deepest areas of Hallownest, where sunlight did not even reach. However, the heat it radiated was such that any strand of thread it touched turned into a flare that consumed the fiber until it left nothing but ashes. A white fire that devoured spider webs as if that were its reason for being. There were no doubts. This insect was specifically equipped and trained to kill weavers. On the other hand, Sun Ce didn't have it easy either, because although he managed to recover before the huge insect reached him with its scythe, he was in a situation even worse than Ghost's. Alien the warrior. Controlled by pale magic, engulfed in an uncontrolled frenzy with a single goal in mind. Their brutality did not recognize between allies and enemies, and their frenzy even ended the lives of several masked weavers who were unlucky enough to be in the middle, not to mention all the abandoned structures and street stalls they found in their path. But none of that was his goal. Well, his mission was exclusively to end the life of the Sendero Verde general, who between somersaults and rapid movements, had only been able to keep his distance, knowing that he would not be able to defeat a monster of that caliber if he faced him head-on. Worried about your little boyfriend? Hornet did not take long to react when after a loud noise, she turned her attention to see Sun Ce's condition. And although she could breathe a sigh of relief when she saw that he was still alive, she had to return her attention to the front when the koppish of her opponent was stopped just millimeters from his face by his needle. Then, he used enough force to push her back. Who are you? What do you want with all this? The Red Weaver asked angrily. Oh, you don't have to be so angry. He said with a peculiar mocking and contemptuous tone of voice. I'm doing you a favor after all. You should be grateful. I would be grateful when I tear off each of your limbs. Well, but how stupid you are. What a disappointment. A lady should at least have a little etiquette. Even a dirty, rustic knitter like you. You're going to swallow those words one by one. You are so vulgar, I feel disgusted at staining my hands with your blood. Hornet's little patience was pushed to the limit before the venom-laden words and the desperate situation. Making all his attention turn to the bastard in front of him. Just what she wanted. On the other hand, Sun Ce could already feel how tiredness was beginning to affect him, and his movements were slower and more tired. Unlike the mad Galeon, whose death did not know rest. His sword could no longer ignore the warrior's scythe, getting closer and closer to its target. In a brutal attack, Galeon swung his scythe with such force that its blade found no resistance against the hard rock. Locking his weapon long enough so that the general could take at least 10 seconds to catch his breath. Sun Ce knew that he couldn't continue running. At this rate, it would only be a matter of time before his muscles reached their limits, and his wobbly limbs were proof enough of that. A single attack. A single opportunity. If he succeeded, it would be a possible victory. If he failed, his funeral. He had to find an opening in the frantic warrior's movements. Or it would be the end. A roar brought Sun Ce out of his thoughts as he saw the rock wall give way to the force of the brutal monstrosity. His breathing erratic, his eyes bloodshot. Nothing about him seemed to show any sign of sanity. It was a beast, a bloodthirsty beast. Sun Ce stood on guard, waiting for the brutal monster to return to its rampant onslaught. He acquired a defensive pose, with his sword horizontal, ready to be launched with all his strength as soon as that long-awaited opening appeared before his eyes. Although would I even be able to find her? I wouldn't be able to see that at the time. What he was able to see was a strange object that hit the middle of Galeon's face. Sun Ce didn't know what the hell that was or where it had come from, but what he could see was how the unstoppable monster was now writhing in pain while he brought one of his hands to his face, desperately trying to remove the strange yellowish liquid that was forming. Had spread across his face when a porcelain jar exploded in his face. Then, a familiar figure appeared next to him. "Well, my special super spicy Bantan soup is surely not to your liking," said a familiar female voice next to him. "You're the cook at the street stall. What the hell are you doing here?" "Call me Tobu, lover," he said while making the edge of 2 butcher knives rub against each other. "That bastard owes me a food stand." Chap. 31 Enemy of my enemy. Alien, the enormous warrior, writhed as he did his best to remove the pungent liquid from his face. The irritation on his skin was overwhelming, enough to overwhelm the hypnosis that had been imposed on him. Everything, in an unbridled frenzy, in which he brandished his scythe in all directions, crossing any structure that was unlucky enough to be in his path. Meanwhile, Sun Ce and Tobu were waiting. At any moment, the colossal insect could recover its previous state and attack again. The Sendero Verde general still maintained his counterattack posture. Waiting, with sword in hand pointing forward, ready to cross the opening as soon as it was revealed before his eyes. Tobu, beside him, also took on a guard stance. A simple glance, and Sun Ce was able to identify that this weaver was more than just a cook. However, both stopped thinking and focused ahead when finally the enormous insect stopped its unbridled anger, remaining completely static looking to the side. The moment had arrived. Interesting. Both Sun Ce and Tobu were surprised. Those words had escaped from the rampaging insect's mouth. They both exchanged glances for a moment to check if their partner had definitely heard the same thing. However, his attention never left the scythe warrior. What a peculiar flavor. The broth has a good flavor and the Cavasuelo's meat has an exquisite texture. The spiciness is strong, but not enough to overpower the flavor of the rest of the ingredients. Fascinating, simply wonderful. This had to be a joke. It was what the warrior and the cook were thinking at the moment, watching Galeon discourse to himself while he savored the rest of the ingredients that still remained on his mask, completely ignoring everything around him. Until one of those masked weavers approached him from behind. "You? Beast. What are you doing?" "You were given an order," said the weaver, clearly enraged. "An order?" the warrior asked skeptically. "I hope you'll excuse the misunderstanding, miss, but Galeon doesn't follow anyone's orders." "Damn useless. Obey." The strangely formal tone of the formerly unbridled beast not only left Tobu and Sun Ce even more confused but also irritated the weaver to the point of raising her needle to whip the warrior and remind him who was in charge. What neither she nor anyone present expected was that Galeon's scythe would be brandished with such force that the 2 separate pieces of the masked weaver's corpse would be brutally thrown against the walls of the caverns, breaking into pieces. Smaller before the brutality of the impact. Tobu's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. It's one thing to see structures being demolished by such brutality. It was quite another thing to see a living body be stripped of life in such a way. Sun Ce, on the other hand, only frowned, now realizing what he had feared so much. That warrior who called himself Galeon was much more dangerous than he really seemed. In fact, he was barely able to see the trace of his attack now that he seemed to have full control of his body and mind. Galeon's face, on the other hand, only maintained a neutral expression. Doubtful. In case having taken a life hadn't bothered him at all. Galeon looked up and tried to understand what was happening around him. Weavers fighting against weavers. That didn't make any sense. However, it wasn't something he really cared about, much less his problems. His mind wandered through his thoughts, but there were some gaps that he was not able to fill. Like the fact of why he was there at that precise moment. However, his side only took on a more relaxed posture as he walked with no concern towards the warrior who maintained a defensive stance towards him and the weaver on the side who seemed to be in some state of shock or something similar. Greetings, citizens. Do you mind if I ask you a question? Don't come close. I don't know what the hell they have in mind. But I will not fall for these nonsense. Sun Ce shouted defensively. Calm down, good sir. I don't want problems. Let's start on the right foot. I am Galeon, a nomadic warrior. To serve you. If the situation was confusing before, it was even more so now, when even Galeon bowed slightly to those he had previously faced. And what are you doing here? Tubo intervened, with a strange look. As if he had something on his mind. I am a wandering warrior. Always looking for the most worthy adversaries and the most exquisite foods. And I must say, I would love to try such a delicacy again that is now wasted on my face. Well, that won't be possible, brute. Since you destroyed my position in your debauchery. I did it. Galeon's face showed his bewilderment. He even didn't hesitate to turn around and see the mess he had left behind him, even though Sun Ce still had the sword pointed at his neck. It was like he didn't even see it as a threat. Oh, how sorry I am. I don't know how and why I made such a grievance, but it is true. At least I have to pay for it. Galeon checks his body a little, but usually lets out a defeated sigh. It seems I have lost my money. I guess there must be some way I can make up for it. In fact I might find it. Said the weaver, with a strange smile on her face. Hey, what do you have in mind? Sun Ce asked worriedly. Maybe he finds a way, Galeon, right? See those masked weavers? It would be very helpful if you would get them out of the way. The warrior looked up and saw his surroundings, then he looked back at the weaver. I understand. However, despite my debt, I cannot simply blind a life for a request. It's not a fair thing. Fair? Those bastards caused a civil war and because of them, famine has killed thousands of innocents. Do you really think that's fair? Galeon was a little surprised by those words, as if something in his mind had been activated. Maybe something he had remembered, but the doubt was still visible on his face. Until he turned his gaze to the green path warrior, whose sword was descending lower and lower as the meaningless conversation for him advanced its course. Is that true? He asked Sun Ce, who only nodded his head in response, causing Galeon to sigh heavily. That's a tragedy. How can someone attack the future of their own people? Of your own children? Galeon showed a sad and empty look as he raised his head and focused on the various combats taking place in the cavern. His face showed a single expression. Disappointment. As his fist grew more solid on the hilt of his scythe. And then, another long sigh escaped his mouth. Very good. As much as you are not happy with the decision, there are insects that do not deserve forgiveness. Diaresis, may my weapon be raised in the name of those who bear no guilt. Diaresis. While this was happening, Hornet and Adia maintained single combat. The weaver, reduced by the ineffectiveness of her skills, by the mastery of her movements polished to perfection. The aggressor, with the advantage of her team and the firm mentality to achieve her objective. Their duel had lasted as long as their eyes were in contact, and already in both of them the marks of fatigue were beginning to affect their movements. Ignorant of the changes that had occurred on the battlefield. My lady. A masked woman's voice suddenly rose, once Adia's Kopish and Hornet's needle collided, making them both step back to catch their breath. What do you want? That thing. He has not betrayed. Adia wasn't even able to ask when a roar shook the chamber. The mastermind of this entire abrupt plan watched in amazement as dozens of his lackeys who were covering the retreat took flight, struck down by an immeasurable force that devastated everything in its path. He didn't need to look to know who it was. Not after what the weaver said. There is nothing else to do. Adia said, apparently not caring about her defeat. Order the retreat. Over my corpse. Exclaimed the weaver in red. If you think you're going to run from me after what you did, you're wrong in the head. Oh, don't get upset like that, little princess. We'll have time to play another day. Also, I still have one more gift for you. Hornet didn't know what he meant, but he didn't care. Her face showed real resentment towards that bastard who referred to her with so much ridicule. He would not rest until he personally separated his head from his body. But Adia had other plans in mind. Hornet watched as her opponent made a powerful jump back and prepared to follow her. But, when he saw how it threw that strange sphere that he was carrying in his hand and radiated that pale light, he knew that something was not right. And he was right. Hornet didn't know what happened, but his body felt heavy. That thing had generated some kind of explosion, but his eyes were barely able to adjust to the light, and his ears were drowned out by loud ringing. Everything was confusing, and his mind was not able to completely stabilize. However, after a few seconds, and with the help of a pair of hands that shook her shoulders and a voice that shouted at her, the princess of Deep Nest little by little returned to reality. Hornet. Wake up, Hornet. The princess opened her eyes, and her temporary blindness gradually faded, revealing Sun C's face a few millimeters from hers, crying out for her name. Hornet didn't know what was happening, but his body felt heavy and moving was almost impossible. She only knew that she was being carried by the general's arms while she tried to figure out what was happening. Although the voices around her only tormented her. We must take her to a doctor. Don't worry, my friend. His mind wanders, but his body looks strong. He just needs time to recover. Buck. This is a disaster, we have to get out of here. General. What should we do? Hornet. Hornet. Are you okay? She's fine. We'll take her outside. Find and remove as many injured people as you can. We have to move. Soldiers, help the weavers. And bring all the water you can. Yes, General. What was happening? What did all the fuss mean? What did they need water for? Hornet was not able to find answers to those questions, and although his senses were gradually recovering, it was not enough to have a complete notion of the situation. At the moment, she could only feel her body shaking, while Sun C's footsteps seemed to be taking her somewhere. A place where the heat he was feeling suddenly vanished from his chitin. Then, the general stopped and turned around, while his voice gave orders to some of those present. By this point, Hornet was already able to regain all his senses. However, I would have preferred not to have done so. When his eyes cleared the image, his heart beat with pain, seeing the uncontrolled pale fire that had spread through the caverns. Flames white as snow, but as deadly as any other. Kaminosu City was prepared to control the fires, since its wooden and fabric structures were highly flammable, but in this crisis, nothing would have an immediate solution. Hornet could only grit his teeth in helplessness, watching as the warehouses where he had to go were now burning in flames. And with them, the food that was inside. Chap. 32, Maternal Bastion. General Nosk, traitor to his people, was slowly approaching the warrior who had awakened his warrior spirit after so many years. It was a battle like he had not experienced in a long time, and his heart was beating strongly, while a huge smile of satisfaction, increasingly more pronounced, was drawn on his face as their fight became closer. The Green Path warrior was capable of fighting alongside his side, despite only wielding small daggers. However, his skills and speed put Nosk in trouble on several occasions. However, all that happiness was quickly replaced by feelings of disappointment when carelessly, the warrior looked away to see his wounded companion. Diaresis, how mediocre must a warrior be to look away in the middle of combat? In a duel to the death, only the present and the opponents matter. Everything around goes into the background. Insignificant. For this reason, his opponent now lay against the wall, with a hole dangerously close to his heart. Diaresis. At least those were the thoughts that passed through the mind of a merciless being like him. However, and despite everything, I had a certain appreciation for him. After all, it was thanks to that warrior that Nosk once again felt the heat of battle. Your body will once again be filled with adrenaline, and your thirst for battle will finally be quenched. For this reason, I would give him a quick and painless death. Nosk advanced steadily towards Ghost. The White Weaver behind him was already condemned, and it was not his problem at all. He couldn't care less about what happened to Kanhachi. However, the fact that the Green Path warrior was looking at that bastard to spider situation made anger take over the enormous arachnid. Diaresis, perhaps, I had misjudged that warrior's mettle. And he was just a pathetic worm like the rest. Looking at an already dead trash instead of facing death by looking it in the eyes. What a disappointment. Diaresis. Nosk finally stopped in front of Ghost, who hadn't even deigned to look at him in all that time. His eyes were only focused on Hachi, who was about to be killed by the masked weavers who had finally overtaken her. Nosk raised his scythe, a sneer escaping his face. One that in the end only translated as the disappointment he felt. The earth shook, time itself suffered a rupture. Nosk had his back turned, and he could only feel how the ground under his feet trembled before the figure that had appeared behind him, while he could listen with satisfaction to its angry roar. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was, because it was a cry of anger. In his ears, it resonated like a melody that brought echoes of a glorious past. The arachnid's stupor was so great that a huge smile of satisfaction once again appeared on his face, while his scythe, previously raised to decapitate its speaker, now slowly lowered to rest on the side of its body. Only then did he slowly turn around to gaze gloriously at that figure he had admired for so many years in the past. Para, the beast. matriarch of Deep Nest. The embodiment of war and an unstoppable force, he once again brandished his two enormous needles against his enemies. He thought to us that he had already forgotten what the bearing of that figure he admired so much was like during the era of conflicts. But who had given in to laziness after the arrival of the Worm Emperor? However, now she was there, in front of him once again, enveloped in the coldest anger as she landed with a crash on Hachi, while her powerful needles devastated everything around her. The masked weavers who were preparing to end the life of the princess could not even react when a legend among legends fell on them like lightning striking the earth. Now, nothing more than shattered shells and pools of blood and viscera scattered on the ground. The mother wrapped her daughter in an unbreakable wall of legs and steel as the masked weavers recoiled from her presence. None were decrepit enough to face her, knowing that all they would find was a quick and merciless death. Madri. The voice with barely any strength rose from the ground. Even in her rage, Hera was able to assume her motherly love in the face of her emotions and turn her head toward her offspring. Seeing her covering her amputated legs to stop the bleeding was something that broke his heart, as did her tired face, on the verge of collapsing from fatigue. Whoever is guilty of this would pay dearly for such insolence. Ha 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 ha, yes. Finally. After so many years. Nosk's voice rose from the suffering of others. His tone showed true joy, stupefied at being able to see his matriarch again shining with the bloodlight that he remembered and longed for. An act so erratic that even some of his followers thought he had lost his sanity. But nothing could be further from the truth. Nosk. Damn it. You are going to pay for what you have done. For what I have done. I'm just going to return Deep Nest to its former glory. Don't you see it? The only thing you have brought is death to your own people. That's how it is. The weak must be purged so that Deep Nest will grow again as the warrior empire it once was. You're inept. And ignorant. Unable to see the stupidity he has done. You are not a savior or a hero, you're just a child who doesn't know how to face consequences. After those words from the matriarch, the happiness on Nosk's face dissipated like a breeze before a blizzard, giving way to a face that only showed deep disappointment, resentment, contempt. As the anger disappeared from the face of the Great Weaver, giving way to a more determined face, but with controlled anger. Nosk understood it. The Hera he had known. The one I admired so much. The one who followed with blind faith to the most bloodthirsty battlefields had already died. She was no longer the ruthless warrior she was before, she no longer had that bloodlust in her eyes. Just that disgusting determination and logic. The Hera that he followed with blind faith died the day he signed peace with that disgusting worm proclaiming himself emperor. His spirit died, now his body had to die. Nosk let out a sigh, knowing that a small hope that still lived within him had already died. His eyes lifted from the floor, now staring at Hera in utter apathy, his fist clenched tightly on his side. There was no point in trying to revive something that was already dead. Nosk lunged forward, at a speed that would seem impossible for someone his size. His scythe fell from the heights with all its force, but Hera's needles managed to stop them in a rock-solid double block, which did not retreat even a millimeter, even though such an attack would be capable of breaking the stone beneath his feet. The arachnid began to launch a dangerous barrage of devastating attacks, while Hera simply blocked each one of them, without even moving a muscle in his lower extremities. Determined to protect her daughter at any cost, who had already fallen unconscious from fatigue and blood loss. You've become slow. Hera has sitting on that throne for so long made you sedentary. The taunt did not go down well, and the Deep Nest matriarch growled angrily in response. He still had that strength that he used to show in the old days. The one that Nosk longed for so much. But age does not forgive even the most powerful of mortals. Despite everything, Nosk would show no mercy for it. His blows were loaded with resentment, contempt, anger. All enhanced by his death scythe and his lack of emotions when fighting. Despite the intensity of the combat, the arachnid was not enjoying it at all. His refusal did not allow it. There they are. Dear lady. Atakid. Thy Deep Nest. A series of screams rose from the upper levels as the royal guard of Kaminosu City swooped down from above. A modest army, but the best of its kind. Covered in red cloaks and golden masks, their needlewomen were the most skilled in the entire kingdom. Trained by Hera personally and his heir of arms Princess Hornet. The masked weavers who followed the general in search of former glory outnumbered them, which to some extent made up for the difference in skills. Quantity versus quality. The oldest war of all. At the very least, this was a relief to the matriarch, who in addition to Nosk, had to be alert for any masked woman who decided that an opening would be a good time to execute a surprise attack. Still, with his brood under his feet, his options were severely limited. However, none of this could matter to Nosk. A warrior should not worry about his surroundings in his eyes. Just go head on and defeat your opponent. And he did that without rest. He could feel it, he could feel Hera's defense weakening more and more, but in trust lies danger, and the sudden brandishing of one of the matriarch's needles found its way onto Nosk's mask, leaving a mark. Just above the one I had already received. Nosk recoiled a little when he felt the cut, but despite being a millimeter away from death, his face showed no expression. As if he hadn't yet been able to accept that he had been damaged. His hand went up, and his claw got stuck in the first fracture made by the ghost, then in the second made by the beast, and then he smiled. Yes, that's what I was talking about. Ghost was barely recovering, using his hand to stop the bleeding, when he heard the arachnid's words. Guttural words, a product of the vocal cords of someone who had given everything to his frenzy. And then he saw it. Nosk lunged at Hera at explosive speed. A simple movement was enough for the ghost to understand that Nosk had never faced him with his full potential. He was underestimating him the whole time. Despising. He never had the chance. The exchange of blows became brutal. Rampant. Nosk had the biggest smile he had ever made in all this time, while Hera gritted her teeth in frustration, looking overwhelmed by the second, as her needles were no longer able to dodge all the attacks, and multiple cuts began to appear on her chitin. One after another. Those who had given themselves over to the fight, leaving any rivalry aside to watch with fear those two monsters battle in a single duel, the advantage being visibly in favor of the traitor general. They put aside their struggles to see the fall of the beast. Crash. No. My queen. Chap. 33 The end of a legend. Time stopped in his mind, and the voices became distant echoes. Lamentations that came to her like distorted sounds, while she felt her body becoming lighter. It was sudden, spontaneous. No time to think. No time to act. Just 2 seconds ago, he had raised his needles to block one of those devastating attacks from his opponent. A cut with such force that it tore one of his weapons from his hands, jamming it dangerously on the rock next to him. The second later everything became chaotic. Hera's body twitched, and an impulse made him want to vomit. Vomit blood. Pink blood from his jaws, while his gaze rushed downwards, and he did everything possible to maintain the strength of his legs. A stream of crimson liquid rushed to the ground, falling at the feet of his offspring, staining his delicate white robe, the fiery scarlet color. The matriarch's breathing became heavy, but she was able to find the strength in her own will to turn her head to the side. Alone, to find how the blade of Nosk's deadly scythe had cut through the chitin of his shoulder. However, the beast would not fall without giving everything it had in battle. Her arm, the one on the opposite side of her wound, was brandished lazily to at least try, with a strength that was not taken from her, to cut the arachnid in front of her. More, Nosk would not hesitate in his actions, and took a step back, removing his weapon from the dying body of the matriarch, causing even more damage than he had already caused. Hera did not scream in pain, although every cell in his body that still responded asked him to do so. Hera's mind was already beginning to wander at this point. She was not a novice. He knew his time was near, but he couldn't give up. Her death was insignificant compared to the responsibility that every mother must face. Protect her offspring at any cost until the last drop of life, and she would be no exception. However, his options were limited. His body felt heavier and heavier. He had completely lost his peripheral vision, becoming a black abyss that increasingly claimed more and more of his visual field. Focusing only on the bastard responsible for all this, who would not hesitate to kill her and her little girl. The left side of his body did not respond. Surely such a wound had cut his nerves, and the fact that he is still standing, although barely, means that by a miracle, his heart had not been destroyed. However, the pain, agony and helplessness persisted. Nosk just sighed heavily at this. Still within him there was some admiration for the warrior Hera once was. A twisted admiration for an unstable psyche. But enough to not want to see the insect that he most admired in this world in such a deplorable way. He would put an end to this, once and for all. Nosk took a few steps forward as he raised his scythe ready to remove Hera's head and begin a new era. A symbolic act in his mind. But terrible in the eyes of the weavers of the royal guard who were not able to separate the masked women to protect their mistress. As helpless as Hera herself felt at that moment. The great weaver accumulated the last strength she had left in her right arm and dragged her needle until she placed it in front of her, more like a support than a weapon, but her half-closed eyes did not take her gaze away from the one she once appreciated so much. He had, and despite all the pain he felt, what he felt for him at that moment was one thing: disappointment. However, the arachnid's instincts kicked in. His eyes widened and his muscles tensed. His limbs moved on their own as the glow of mortal danger loomed over his head, even though he was not even able to see it. Nosk jumped back, fast enough to avoid a deadly sharp blade that wedged itself into the stone like butter, yielding to the hot knife. The weaver saw in amazement that it was a spear. A majestic spear, which he would never be able to forget. Steel shaft black as night, culminating in a golden double-edged blade and 2 other blades on its sides. Impossible to identify whether it was a spear or a lance, but it had an impressive level of detail. One that didn't even get bruised when it hit the solid rock. Still not coming out of their stupor, everyone saw a shadow fall seconds later. A shadow that took the unique weapon and ripped it from the ground as if it were a mere toothpick before raising its dangerous blade towards the traitor's face. A shadow who only let out words of rage while clenching his teeth. Damn labyrinth. Pave Ghost let out in a strangled sigh. Bear regained consciousness for a few seconds, seeing the brilliant golden leaf stained in blood, which rose in front of the girl who now turned her back to him, with her mane of leaves and her athletic body. Willing to face the bastard who caused so much evil in these lands. However, only a smile appeared on the matriarch's face, as she tried to speak with a strength that was increasingly scarce in her body. Blue boo bastard, haha, I see that you were busy. Your Majesty. Keed exclaimed. Conserve all the strength you can and stay behind me. Keed did not look away from the arachnid at any time, even though he was in a state similar to shock, while his eyes did not leave the weapon of the young woman in front of him. He recognized it, he had seen it a couple of times before and he remembered perfectly how lethal it could be as well as its bearer. Hence that explains why I could only see a third of my troops. You've been busy, young lady. Nosk's voice regained its usual malice as he looked with satisfaction at the fresh blood still on Keed's weapon. She, likewise, had some wounds on her body, but nothing serious, and part of her leaf ornament had suffered irregular cuts. Which was confirmed by his agitated breathing. However. Nosk. The voice behind the arachnid caught everyone's attention, seeing an agitated insect, followed by a group of masked weavers. Adia. You arrive at the perfect time. That's enough, idiot. We must go. The arachnid looked at her for a few seconds with disgust, but Adia's expression did not waver at this. His eyes were placed on the gigantic warrior without any fear. Quite the opposite. It was a defiant look. A look from someone who was not afraid to challenge the one who had ended the reign of Hera, the beast. However, it was Nosk who let out a dissatisfied gesture, frowning in anger, but he knew that she was right. The enormous insect simply raised its enormous eye then placed it on its shoulder as it turned towards the group behind it. As he retreated, he exchanged one last look with Ghost, who was barely managing to get to his feet, still suffering from fatigue from blood loss. However, Nosk could see it. That empty look of the ghost at him. That resentment springing from those beads as black as the night. However, Nosk only smiled at what this implied and he continued on his way. Don't let them escape. The voice of one of the red-cloaked weavers rose through the crowd and the royal guard forces charged at their enemies with brutal ferocity. The traitors, confused by the sudden turn of events, raised their weapons again against the loyalists. Chaos spread throughout the area as more and more of the royal guard claimed dominance over the traitors. The last remnants of a senseless rebellion, driven only by the greed of some and the thirst for war of others. Keed stood her ground, striking down with her deadly spear those desperate weavers who believed that personally executing the dying regent of Deep Nest and her unconscious offspring would be the end of their problems. More, the only thing they found was a quick and merciless death by the blades of the brush-haired warrior's weapon. An impenetrable bastion like her father before her. Bear watched with some satisfaction the deadly dance that girl performed around him, but the strength in his body dissipated like dust blown by the wind. His left legs finally gave out, falling mere millimeters from Hachi's body just below. And as much as she had wanted to stay upright, her body collapsed right next to her daughter, while her right hand dropped the enormous needle to her side. With her last breath, the great weaver's hand crawled to Hachi's body as tears began to drip from her 3 pairs of eyes. Mother's tears. Tears of pain, seeing her beloved daughter in that state. Nothing that was happening around him was important. None of the weapons clashing with each other. None of the traitorous lids that were blinded. None of the cries of his followers clamoring for his name or rank, desperately asking him not to abandon them. Only his little girl's face mattered, with closed eyes pointing in his direction. Hera's shaky hand managed to reach her, and her mortal warrior hands exerted a gentle and maternal touch on her offspring's face. Her heart, increasingly erratic, felt a primordial relief when she could still feel her little girl's breathing. Weak but alive. And among the few tears that his fluid-lacking body allowed him to expel, Hera gave a small smile. The last of all. The second before his hand collapsed on the ground without strength and his spirit ascended to the divine plane. Hera, the beast, he had finally breathed his last. Chap. 34, Silence. The peace of pain followed the chaos of discontent, and when the truth came to light, the weight of guilt in many hearts crushed both dreams and hopes. The devastated civilian population could not believe the truth when the news was revealed to them. How they had been manipulated by hunger and the actions of a traitor who spoke false promises. As such a decision had not only cost him the lives of hundreds of his peers, family and friends, but also the life of his regent, who fought fiercely to protect his kingdom, losing his life in the process. Many were afraid. Terrified of the consequences of their actions. Many, at the very least, expected a sentence for the rest of their lives. Others, less optimistic, hoped to find their end behind the executioner's blade. However, none of that happened. They were 2 long days of agony. 2 days in which a devastated town expected the worst, while its leaders tried to find a solution to the most urgent problems. What no one expected was that it would be Sun Ce, a foreigner from other lands, the one whose voice would be the most heard among those present. For some, a divine gift. For others, an offense to their traditions. Power, even if emergency, in the hands of an outsider. However, the mind of the Deep Nest general did not tremble in the face of difficulties. Although he did not have the natural talent of his brother, the eldest brother of the Sun family took the necessary measures to get out of this crisis as soon as possible. The first was the extreme rationalization of the few foods that remained, including nobles and political figures, who flatly refused at first. However, when the first middle-class nobleman was stripped of his fortune and his house deceived and turned into a refuge for those who lost their home, it made the rest of the nobles more aware of the matter. Unfortunately, in such a crisis, the slightest act of insubordination would not be allowed, and the royal guard of Kamonosu City was willing to follow the one who followed their leaders at the most crucial moments. Second, Keed was sent with great haste back to Sendero Verde, carrying a direct order from Sun Ce himself explaining the situation, requiring food immediately. A direct request from the nation's highest general, incapable of being invalidated unless the empress herself or the minister decided otherwise. Something they did not object to upon reading the letter that the swift warrior personally delivered into the hands of Empress Shuang. Deep Nest, he could only wait. Wait in agony. The morning after the end of the riots, an unbeatable heart was shattered at the edge of a bed inside the Hall of War. Hornet was not able to bear her cries, crying inconsolably at the foot of the place where the body of Hera, the beast, the greatest monarch that Deep Nest could ever have, lay, deprived of the right to life for simple selfish actions. The psychological blow for the Weaver in Red was devastating. Unable to find comfort in anything or anyone around him. His mother taken from his life. His sister, dying, deprived of 2 limbs, weak from blood loss, lay on her bed in her room. Bretta's medical care was vital to her recovery, but Ghost refused to leave her side. The Ghost had once again fallen into its mental breakdown. Choking on the guilt and helplessness of not having been able to do something. Of not being able to defeat that traitor and save Hachi. But he couldn't. Quite the opposite. He became another burden, and his weakness almost condemned him and Hachi to death. Now, he was just another shadow in the White Weaver's room. One that did not take her eyes off the dying figure, analyzing every breath, every beat of her weak heart. With a sick terror that last beat, perhaps it could be the last. No matter how many times Bretta herself told her that Hachi's life, although weak, was out of danger. And while a part of Ghost believed his word, another part refused to fully accept it. The third afternoon had arrived after the riots. The work of the Sendero Verde general had been able to keep the concerns of civilians at bay, and although food was scarce, the insufficient rations were capable of keeping everyone nourished until help arrived. According to their calculations, they should only last 3 or 4 more days. Now able to take a breather, Sun Ce almost shuffled through the empty halls of the war hall. His eyes, marked by the exhaustion of 3 days of overexertion with only 6 hours of sleep in total. Still, he kept going. Why would someone like him help a foreign nation in this crisis? Compassion. Honor. Duty. It was an answer to which I didn't have a completely clear answer. Again. The general's tired knuckles touched the wood of a huge door, a door guarded by 2 weavers of the royal guard, but who did nothing to stop his advance. They couldn't. They didn't want to. The general sighed deeply, hearing no response from the other side. He looked at each of the weavers, but they did not return a word, only sad looks that fell on the cold stone floor. Unable to know what they should do. Sun Ce waited for a few seconds, thinking about what he should do. In his right hand rested a bowl with some hot food. The smoke billowed slowly, creating a pale trail that danced in front of his eyes. He looked at the door and made a decision. His free hand slid to the doorknob, and seeing that none of the weavers attempted to stop him, he continued forward. The huge door opened slowly, revealing a colossal room, dark and with a gloomy atmosphere inside. No one had ever set foot inside the room that once belonged to Hera, the beast, much less someone from other lands. The door closed slowly, and the little light that filtered into the place barely allowed him to see properly, while his eyes adjusted to the darkness. One would think that the regent of a kingdom would live in more ostentatious conditions, but the simplicity of the place would be on par with any middle-class room in Sendero Verde. Only a couple of pieces of furniture decorated the place, with the hunting trophies being what stood out the most. Skulls and parts of colossal creatures, worthy of being remembered. And right in the background, a huge empty bed, at whose feet lay a weak figure barely covered by a red cloak. Hornet heard the sound of footsteps and looked up for a second. His eyes, bloodshot from crying, exchanged glances with the general's exhausted eyes. However, her gaze moved away after a few seconds, unable to look at him because of the shame she felt. She was the current leader of Destined. I was aware of that. She was the one who should be out there, managing her town and helping them through this crisis. She, as the only one of the cons who could still stand on her own. And not an insect from other lands. However, he couldn't do it. Hornet's body was devastated. More from the emotional pain than the physical pain. The trail of tears that had stopped flowing for 2 days due to dehydration left marks on his face. Irregular lines that fell from the sockets of his eyes to the tip of his chin. His muscles, exhausted and cramped from not moving for hours. The only thing she could do was look away so that Sun Ce wouldn't see her in that state. However, unlike anything she could believe, the Sun's oldest son didn't say anything. In an act that lacked any kind of common sense or respect, the general sat next to him, sharing the same cold rock floor space. Hornet did not want to see it, but the doubts about the insect's actions were greater. His head turned in his direction, and his crimson eyes rose to the general's dark circles. However, soon his gaze fell instinctively, following his nose to the bowl of food in the general's hand. Whoever offered it to him had a tired smile on his face. Hornet refused to accept it in an instant. Maybe out of pride. Maybe because of shame. But his stomach clearly informed him that he needed those foods. The weaver gave a long sigh, accepting the wooden bowl from the hands of the general, who waited patiently for her to take it. Neither of them said a word. Hornet began to eat the food slowly. She was hungry, but her emotional state did not allow her to eat with the vigor with which she usually did. Little by little, the few rations of soybeans disappeared into the jaws of the weavers, while both remained in a deathly silence. Without saying anything. The weaver in red had already consumed 2 of her rations, and her body was grateful for the slightly salty broth that her food possessed. And once his word was slightly hydrated, he decided to ask something that had been on his mind for a long time. "Why are you doing this?" The words escaped Hornet's mouth with a mixture of doubt and melancholy. As if the general's response scared her in some way. Which didn't make sense to her. Sun Ce kept his head pointed at the ground, as if he was searching for an answer. However, no response escaped his mouth. Hornet didn't know if this lack of response was better or worse. But the general's silence bothered her somehow. He ate a little more of his portion, this time with some discomfort, although he was not aware of it. And then. He asked again without looking away from the front. "Are you doing this out of obligation? For honor? Or for something else?" Several seconds passed, but there was no response from Sun Ce either. Hornet finished her meal, already somewhat annoyed by the general's silence. His growing indignation at his interference gradually replaced his sadness, and when there was not a single drop of broth left in his plate, he turned angrily towards the general to demand an answer. However, when she saw him, her annoyed expression softened to one of shock. Sun had fallen asleep next to him, a victim of the accumulated fatigue of these last few days. A body is capable of resisting several days without water. Some are able to last even weeks without eating food. But lack of sleep is something that eventually cannot be endured. Sun Ce's head fell forward, although his hunched body somehow managed to maintain its balance. His snoring was so light that Hornet was unable to hear it because of his own chewing. And on the weaver's face, a small smile appeared for a few seconds. A smile that turned into concern and amazement when he saw how the general's large body little by little began to fall forward. Hornet put the plate aside and quickly managed to grab it. It was incredible how Sun Ce had not woken up despite the shock. "I was really exhausted." The weaver managed to accommodate it and leaned the general's back to the side of the bed, but a miscalculation caused the heavy insect to slide in her direction. The weaver felt the weight and her hands, still somewhat weak, could not contain it. The only way she had was to use her own body as a buttress to try to prevent Sun Ce from collapsing against her. A rather parodic situation in his opinion. After that, he let out a heavy sigh. Hornet saw the general, and a feeling of guilt settled in his mind as he felt his heavy breathing. She was the one who should be leading her people. Not him. But there it was. Acting like a scared little girl, hiding in the room of her late mother, whose body now rested next to her ancestors. How pathetic she felt at that moment. She wasn't aware of how much time had passed, but she was sure it was enough of regret. It was time to act like what it was. The leader of Destined. At least until his sister woke up. The weaver used some of her strength restored by the food to straighten Sun Ce, leaving him in a rather delicate balance. But at least it didn't seem to move. Seeing him so sound asleep was too much to keep from laughing as she stood up once more. It took a while for his legs to respond, but as soon as possible, he began his journey out of the room. Her hand turned the handle determinedly, and when she opened the door, the freshness of the outside hit her face. At the same time, the 2 weavers of the royal guard opened their eyes when they saw her, just before kneeling on the ground as a sign of respect. "Your Honor. It fills us with joy to see her again," one said as soon as the joy allowed him to formulate a few words. "Enough wasting time. Prepare a bath and call the ministers for an emergency meeting in an hour. Yes, your lady. Suddenly, the three of them were alarmed when they heard a loud noise coming from inside the room. As the weavers of the royal guard looked on in amazement, Hornet let out a smile, seeing how Sun Ce had finally lost his balance and crashed to the ground. Still, he was still fast asleep. And take the general to his room. Yes, your lady. Chap. 35, uncertain future. The remaining days passed like silent laments. A town lacking reasons to celebrate, moving forward with the hope of a better tomorrow. Hornet finally took the reins of her people, and her presence in every corner of Deep Nest was greeted with a mixture of hope and melancholy. Wherever he went, his figure was received with respect, with words of encouragement and condolences for the loss. But the weaver in red stood firm in the face of the words of encouragement. I had cried enough. However, on the 7th day after the tragedy, Deep Nest received the caravan from Sendero Verde with faith and hope, this time, with Sun Quang at the head and accompanied by Keed. Even the son's own middle brother, still with some resentment towards the weavers, could not help but feel the pressure in his chest when he saw the devastation that the betrayal had left in Kaminosu City. The caravan, smaller this time due to lack of preparation and lack of time, was personally greeted by Deep Nest's royal guard, as well as its new regent and important ministers. Hornet would not allow another tragedy to unfold, and by this point, his confidence was so shaken that he simply could not turn his back on this matter and delegate it to someone else's clutches. On Hornet, a pleasure to see you again. We came as soon as we received the news. Sun Quang commented as soon as he got off the cart that was guiding the group and positioned himself in front of the weaver, giving her a small show of respect. We appreciate your presence, General Quang. Deep Nest will be eternally grateful for this show of protection. Our retribution to the treaty will be immediate. We'll talk about that later. I know that now there are issues that require more of your attention. Sun Quang may not have liked the idea of staying in Deep Nest for long, but he was sensible enough to understand the urgency of this matter. Hornet thanked this understanding silently and with a small bow before turning around and addressing his soldiers. She would personally descend to the lower levels of Kaminosu City and distribute the rations among the population. Meanwhile, Sun Quang, accompanied by Keed, stepped aside, heading to where the eldest son was waiting with Bretta at her side. You look terrible. Sun Quang commented as soon as he was close to his brother. They have been difficult days. The words of the son's middle brother were not without reason. Although more relieved, the dark circles on the eldest brother's face were still present, and judging by his moderately drooping shoulders, it could be assumed that his body also showed symptoms of fatigue and hardship. I understand. Nice to see you again, Miss Bretta. The pleasure is mine, Sun Quang-sama. I hope you will excuse my request, but my brother and I need to discuss some important matters. Although discreet, Sun Quang's words were not without imperative character. Both Bretta and Keed nodded and left, leaving the siblings in an overwhelming silence. Then, it was the oldest who broke the calm. How are you, sister? Sun Quang lets out a sigh of regret. Tired like everyone else. Hey, I'm sorry I didn't think. Okay, Sun Ce. He stopped him with words and a wave of his hand. You don't have to explain to me. Not to me. I know you well enough. But don't abuse the Empress's trust. Hey, you sound just like Dad. I'll take that as a compliment. Well. I will talk to Hornet and explain the situation. Are you already referring to the Queen of Deep Nest by her name? He said with an ironic tone and with a raised eyebrow. It's complicated. I see, just remember Sing Su, I guess she needs an answer. Sun Ce's face let out a bitter look as a heavy sigh escaped his mouth. That was a conversation that would not be pleasant at all. A commitment imposed by the camaraderie of their parents. But nothing more than a friendship for both young people. Well. Future problems. The younger brother burst in. Now let's finish this. And where is Ghost? The question was not met with emotion, and Sun Ce's tired eyes fell to the ground. He didn't need to say it for his brother to understand, causing Sun Quan to sigh long as he looked up at the rock ceiling. However, inside the war room, a stepsister's curiosity could not be appeased with silence and waiting alone. Much more so, when Keat and Bretta headed to the room where the weaver in white lay. Have you not eaten anything in 7 days? The taller one asked with concern after hearing the news. No. We've tried everything but he just doesn't react. We stopped trying when Sun Ce-sama almost loses an arm trying to force him out of the room. It's like he's dead. I can't believe it happens again. Bretta looked up upon hearing the words of the large insect and saw with concern how a face of anguish appeared on the fallen face of Lupu's daughter. Keed's gaze fell to the ground as painful memories returned to her mind. Memories whose hope told him he would never have to relive again. Will it happen again? The beetle asked, hiding its urgent need to know in a face of naivety. Keed gave a long sigh as her steps became slower and heavier inside the palace. As if his will had suddenly transformed into not wanting to reach his destination. Or at least delay as long as possible. His mind wrestled with the morality of revealing a move that wasn't his own, but he knew Breda well enough for his mind to wrestle with whether or not it was right to tell her the truth. In the end, the need to share that bitter burden was more compelling than maintaining silence. That's how he spent many days when I knew him. A boy who sat for days in a dark corner of the temple. I didn't eat. He didn't move. A statue of flesh and exoskeleton. In my innocence I tried to get closer many times, but all I received was silence. My father was the only one who managed to force him out, and his controlled anger would explode violently in the endless training sessions. It was my father who had to force him to train as well as force him to stop. Deed's face became increasingly gloomy with the story, and Breda tried to assimilate the story, imagining in her mind a younger version of Ghost, but mired in a misery of self-blame and rage. An image that bruised his heart. Until a light but unexpected smile escaped Keed's face. Ghost found peace in his mind, in the pain of his body. But it was a piece of deception. Not towards anyone around him, but towards himself. Time taught her to hide her emotions, and dealing with him went from impossible to unbearable. They both had the luxury of laughing lightly at that. I remember the day when he finally sat down at the table next to us. I worked hard to prepare that dinner, and my father congratulated me for my effort, but do you know what Ghost said? Breda just looked expectantly for the answer. Diuresis, it doesn't taste like anything diuresis. The sudden laughter was overshadowed by a trace of bitterness as his footsteps echoed in the deathly silence inside the palace. However, the story continued its course when another tired sigh from Keed escaped her mouth. Then I understood that he didn't mean to offend me. He only told the truth. His truth. I understood that Ghost had lost many reasons to live, his sense of taste and smell included. He only reacted when something was dangerous, but nothing that made him want to be alive. And I just accepted it like that. I was hoping that would change over time, and these past few days, that hope was materializing with every minute. Seeing him show interest in something, seeing him alive again was. The big insect's words got stuck in his mouth while a lump of sadness and helplessness formed in his throat. Breda looked up, only to see a tear running down Keed's face, while her teeth clenched tightly. The beetle wasn't tall enough to give him a supportive hand on his shoulder, but the gesture felt just as comforting on his forearm. The girl with natural hair looked down and found a face just as sad, but much less helpless, and with a hopeful smile on her lips. A smile that he did his best to transfer to his own face. Keed sighed deeply, and her thumb wiped away the tear that had escaped her stoicism. His eyes returned to the front, regaining his composure and his stoic face, although his insides were still just as sore. But, his steps regained their strength, and the journey to Hachi's room was considerably shortened. Once they arrived, 2 weavers from the royal guard were guarding the place. And they both knew them equally. Breda, the one who had cared for Hakon's wounds all this time, with a skill even superior to the nation's own doctors, and Keed, the mysterious warrior who ended the lives of dozens of traitors in hidden passages of Deep Nest. Traitors who were destined to intercept Hera and his group on the way. Both weavers bowed in respect in his presence and stepped aside to enter the place. Breda took the lead and opened the door, then invited the tall child to continue on her way. Keed hesitated for a moment, questioning if she was ready to see the one she considered a brother once again in that state. However, his determination was greater than his refusal. Once Breda gently closed the door, they both went inside to meet the only 2 figures that occupied the room. Hachi, convalescing on the bed, in the same position in which he had rested all these days. His body, covered by a soft and warm blanket, which kept his wounds at an optimal temperature. His breathing, slow but constant, showed accumulated fatigue from days without food or water. However, they could only wait. On the other hand, just a few steps from the weaver's bed, there was a living statue. Ghost, completely motionless, seemed to have fallen into a kind of induced coma, although his kneeling body maintained perfect balance. Knowing whether he was awake or not was impossible, since his dark sockets showed no signs of lucidity. Breda approached the weaver's bed, as her bandages needed to be changed. Usually a weaver would help her, but now Keed was there to help her. The beetle removed the sheet, and not even the weaver's naked body brought Ghost out of his slumber, if he was even alive at the time. Breda removed the old bandages, revealing the stumps that had remained, where before Hachi proudly showed those limbs with which he so gracefully played his strings. His 2 left center limbs now showed a healthy recovery, and the wound, although still slightly dormant, had almost completely healed. Next, Breda got to work, and with a cloth and a bucket of crystal clear water, she began to clean the convalescent weaver, receiving help from Keed when necessary. And once the chitin on its skin was sufficiently clean, the beetle covered the exposed wound again, because the least they wanted was for an unexpected infection to further aggravate the situation. Then, they covered Hachi again between her sheets, as she was when they both arrived at the compound. "Could you bring me a cloth and clean water?" Breda nods at Keed's request and leaves, returning a few minutes later with her request. The beetle had an idea of her intentions, since she did not have the courage to do it. Keed took the bucket and rag and approached Ghost slowly. Breda was very nervous because the last time Ghost moved was when he took Sun C's hand that was trying to move him and twisted it abruptly. The beetle still remembers the general's cry of pain, and since then, no one had dared to get closer than necessary. However, Keed didn't seem to be afraid of this. In fact, from the way he was approaching, it was assumed that it was not the first time he had done it. The leaf-haired insect saw her stepbrother with regret, a thin layer of dust accumulating on the chitin of his head and his black cape. Keed removed the dusty cloak, revealing the ghost's black body, contorted into a fetal pose. Removing his equipment where he kept his hidden weapons was a titanic task, as Ghost did not give in the slightest for such a task. And despite Breda's concern and fear, the ghost didn't seem to react to the way Keed invaded her personal space. As if he were capable of recognizing her in her abyss of guilt. Keed took the wet cloth and began to clean Ghost's antlers, who did not move an inch. As if it were really a statue. His muscles seemed to be in a state of constant tension, rigid as solid rock. And his slow breathing was almost imperceptible. Drops of water loaded with dust fell down his white mask until they fell on his body, and the dirt was removed as the wet cloth applied both pressure and delicacy equally. An ephemeral bath wherever Keed's hands were able to reach. And finally, a white cloth from Hachi's room was wrapped around her body while Breda took the black cloak to wash it. Unfortunately, there wasn't much more either of them could do other than grab the bowl of cold broth that Breda had left next to the ghost in the morning. The last in a series that had been repeated in the previous days. And with soft steps, both left that bed of sadness and bitterness. Neither of them, able to see how the little consciousness that the ghost had left, let out an iota of its presence in the form of a tear, once both had left the premises. Despite the help, there was no celebration anywhere in Deep Nest that night. The tables of the city once again provided the much desired food, but every mouth in the city ate in silence. And it was no exception in the war room dining room. The long table shared the presence of several diners. Hornet, sitting in her usual seat, still did not dare to occupy the position that previously belonged to her mother. A huge chair located at the end of the table. At his side, Sun C, who had been invaluable support during all these days, and next to him, Breda, who had taken care of her sister like no one would have been able to imagine. At the front was Sun Quang, whose voice was ready to break the silence with hundreds of questions. But something inside him forced him to remain silent. For even Keed, sitting next to him, had that blank expression as she lazily ate from her plate. And it was Hornet's heavy sigh that destroyed the silence. We appreciate all the help that Sendero Verde has given us. For this reason, we will prepare several carts with products we make as a thank you. Sun Quang heard those words, and although it was fair, something different was beating in his chest at that moment. You don't need to hurry. Sendero Verde can wait a little longer. No need. Several of the ministers are already taking care of the matter, and a group of merchants are willing to join you in your return. I am glad to hear it. There were not many words related to the exchange. Only what is precise and fair. The minimum necessary before attention fell on the plates in silence. But after a few minutes, it was Breda's voice that rose this time. Sun C-sama, Sun Quang-sama. I ask permission to stay here until Kan Hachi is restored to health. Alright. I will inform Mr. Yamato of the situation. I assume Ghost Dono will also stay. Hornet commented. It seems so. I don't think anyone can get him out of that state. And I don't dare let him try to detach my arm again. Is it that bad, brother? Yes, it is. I don't understand, commented the weaver. Ghost Dono doesn't show interest in anything because he refuses to abandon my sister. What is its purpose? Sometimes the heart does not force us to do things that we are not aware of. Sun C's response was soft as a sigh, but his tired gaze did not move away from the plate in front of him, unable to see the small blush forming on the Tejirota's face. Something that did not go unnoticed by Sun Quang, who was the only one who was aware of every detail of the table. However. It's more than that. Breda's sudden voice took everyone by surprise. What do you mean? Sun Quang asked, possibly the least in the mood on the floor. Breda didn't respond immediately. Her mind wandered a little into her memories as the same moral doubt that Keed had hours ago now attacked her. The beetle looked at those present who had their eyes on her, some tiredly, others sadly. But all with interest. My memories about that time are vague and blurry, but I remember Mr. Elderbug-sama, Ghost-sama's pa-father, playing the erhu with enthusiasm. Ghost, I and a friend used to listen to him play some afternoons. He was a master, and his melodies were intoxicating. When Kan Hachi first played in front of me, we were in Captain Yamato-sama's villa. Its melody was very similar and just as harmonious, and when Ghost-sama heard it for the first time something changed in him. I think he found in Princess Hachi something he had lost, a memory of his past. Ghost doesn't remember his past. Keat added. Every time we tried to ask him about it, his mind began to saturate him with memories of the tragedy, and controlling his screams of pain were heartbreaking. My father and I just stopped trying. For fear of his mental stability. No one knows what happened to Ghost Sama that night. Breda spoke again. He never talks about it. Every time memories come to his mind, they are in the form of nightmares that torment him at night. And these nights, have you had any? Sun Quang asked. No, although I can't even be sure if he has slept. I guess we can't do anything but wait. 2 days passed, and preparations to return to Sendero Verde were ready. As promised, 3 carts full of fine fabrics and crafts were ready to leave for Sendero Verde, and several carts belonging to local merchants were ready to accompany the generals back home. Unfortunately, Sun Si's stay in Deep Nest had taken too long, and his responsibilities as the military leader of the Green Path could no longer be postponed. Keed, to her regret, also had to return, although that would mean leaving Ghost in that state. At least he had the relief that Breda would take care of him in his absence. After all, once his father returned from the Empire, extremely sensitive issues would have to be brought to the table. There were only a few hours left before the caravan left the city, and Sun Quang was organizing the troops that accompanied him, as well as the merchants who would accompany them. Inside the palace, Hornet had just finished preparing to make the formal farewell to the event, helped by 2 weavers she trusted, when the sudden knock on her door caught the attention of those present. Your lady, General Sun Si requests a meeting with you. Commented one of the guardians outside. Tell him to come in. After his words, the handle of the door to his room opens, revealing the general who entered the room. Somewhat recovered after these 2 days of rest, but still somewhat disheveled. Although ready for the trip. You look beautiful. His words escaped with a smile when he saw the Red Weaver, wearing a clothing much more decorated than her usual red robe. Something worthy for a public event, recommendation from one of your trusted ladies. Although those ruffles and the red bow on one of its horns seemed to not be entirely to the weaver's liking. The Genos. At his command, the 2 weavers paid their respects and left the place, closing the door delicately behind them. You look well. It's serious. Too many decorations. I feel overwhelmed with all this. It's not like Deep Nest. Then, choose something you like more. Of protocols, you know how it works. Hee. Yeah. I know. A small moment of silence after the words. Moment when both looked directly into each other's eyes, as if waiting for something. The seconds passed, and the silence became more and more uncomfortable, and it was Sun Si himself who broke the ice, approaching and shamelessly taking Hornet's hands with his own. The next time we meet, I'm going to ask you to marry me. Hornet's eyes widened at the news. Sun Si had done some research and knew that weavers preferred males who were direct with their feelings. And Sun Si was already tired of running away from them. Now, with the same courage that confronted her that first time they both saw each other on the battlefield, he faced her in this battle of ties and feelings. Hornet, nervous, lowered her gaze and looked at her own hands held by Sun Si's, who, despite his calm attitude, could not hide his nervousness in the slight tremor of his hands, waiting for an answer that could be so confusing. Like the agitated waters of a river. However, the weaver's sudden defiant smile was as clear as her words. I'll have to wait, it seems. The answer, although it was not a definitive yes, filled the general's heart with relief and hope, who with a show of elegance, kissed the weaver's right hand, honoring the manners of his homeland. Who knows when they will see each other again? Who knows under what circumstances they would do it? What they did know was that that day would come. Unfortunately, the wait came to an end, and those from distant lands had to return home, leaving doubts and longings behind them. The uncertainty of the future, and the hope for a brighter future. What would the future hold for them? No one would be able to know that. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown and left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.